Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shalom. I go by the appellation of Melchizedek Yis-RoyAl. I come from one of the 12 tribes of the holy nation of Israel. I am a Hebrew. I am an Haitian Hebrew Israelite. I do claim my African lineage as well, as you know, because of the West Atlantic slave trade, and my Taino history as well, although I'm not mixed with Taino or nothing like that, but my people are living in the land of Taino. This is part 7 to our video pertaining to Ahiti and the Taino and the Arawak and the Negroes, Black African Americans and Cuban, Brazilian, all that stuff, the whole World War things. But we're continuing on in part 7 from where we left off. Happy Shabbat Day, Yom Shabbat Shema, Yom Shabbat Shalom, peaceful Shabbat Day, happy Shabbat Day. We're in the 5th day of the 8th month called Heshvan Mabul. We're in the second portal in the second semester of fall, and we're in the 7th day of the week. According to their time, the heathen time, we're in October 22nd, 2015. They say it's Thursday. And it says, actually it's 5:18, they said on the clock. This is off. This is always off. But before we begin, I do want to start off with this very, very extremely important video. I think it's important because it lets you know a little bit more about why our people are the way they are. Obviously, we've been stripped of our language. We've been stripped of our customs, of our practices, of our inheritance, of our land, territory, ordinances, the way we used to dress up. They try to do away with our codes. They try to do away with our priestlyhood, with the not just the sacrifices, but the ceremonies we used to do at altars for cleansing and things like that. And they try to keep us away from where we really came from and who we truly are, the magnificence of who we are. They try to keep us away from our time. They try to keep us away from our calendar, our weeks, our months, even the names of them, even the names of the stars and things like that. They're trying to completely annihilate us and destroy us from off the face of the earth through what they have taught us as truth. I've read a lot today about Antiochus Epiphanes, which was a great enemy of the Hebrews back then. He was the reason why the Hebrews began to worship Zeus. They called it the temple of Jupiter, which is the temple of Jesus, of Zeus, of Baal. So the people used to worship that because they were forced to, and to sacrifice abominable meats like pig, swine on the Most High's altar. This caused the wrath of the Most High to descend upon us, just like the worship of Zeus and the cross, which is their altar, which come from the Knight Templars and the Grecians, the children of Alexander the First. So these people brought to us Jesus and Zeus and destroyed our people, and whitewashed all history, and try to change everything. So they're the ones who also brought the idea of being a pimp, the idea of being a hoe. They brought the idea of prostitution, because our women were sold onto prostitution when the white man had kidnapped our people, the Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English. When they had kidnapped our people, they had sold the women into prostitution like pimps do, and they would put their hands on the women and hit them and actually sexually abuse and verbally abuse the women, unto the point like they like being called the B word, be this, be that, or I'm a beat that, in all these languages and stuff. They got people like Snoop Dogg, R. Kelly, and things like that try to act like pimps, prolonging the mentality of the master, of the slave master, plantation owner, because he used to force our women into prostitution. Nowadays our women are willing to prostitute for money. The people are gaining the world but losing their soul, and they're serving mama and they're not serving spirit and truth, which is the spirit, not the soul or the body. So our people fell greatly. Now they got women twerking on music videos and stuff. which is a sign of master's doctrines. The worship of Zeus, the master's doctrine. Love thy enemy, master's doctrine. When they try to bring us New Testament and things like that, especially dealing with the Galatians, and things like that, these people try to pervert everything as well. And we went through a lot. So we lost a lot about who we are, and we adapted to a lot of the masters, the plantation masters' ordinances, rules, codes, and procedures. A lot of Hebrews back then, even in the revolt of the Maccabees, were wicked, and they went out deceiving other Hebrew brethren and sisters out there during the time of Josephus and things like that. And they were getting licenses from the master to do certain practices after the heathen. So our people began to follow that Christian Catholic enslavement stuff that sorely grieved us and which have oppressed us for so long. In the face of Caesar Borgia, which is that picture of Zeus, which remind me of Christopher Columbus, Christ, and things like that. So a lot of Hebrews or black people were okay with it during that time, while many remained loyal and they died for not partaking in those sacrifices. Also, the idea of birthday also come from these Grecian people. They have also conquered Egypt at a point during the death of Alexander, and he broke into 4 kingdoms, the kingdom of brass. But it's proof that the Grecians and us been fighting for a while, and that Christian Catholics will not be saved. That whole religion was pushed upon us. That belief was pushed upon us by the ancestors of the Greeks. Now, as far as the scripture, I believe that the Most High's words are found in it. It can help us in reconstructing ourselves and rebuilding ourselves. But we cannot if we don't know who we really are and what happened in the real world and on those ships, those African tribes that were brought on those ships, man. That got to be accounted for because the blood of the ancestors are crying. So in this video is going to talk about pretty much the originality of the whole thing about pimps, twerking. I believe what Miley Cyrus is doing is very racist, discriminative and prejudiced, and I'm not prejudging her based on the booty and all that physical aspect, but the whole point that twerking and dancing on poles, lap dances originated from forced sex slavery on our women. There's still today a bunch of sex slaves, and they're the people that be in your porno videos and things like that. And you gotta watch out because these people are slaves. They're being brought into slavery, and it's not just only slavery too, or active fornication. It's also a sign of masculinity, feminism, effeminism as well, sodomy, as well as sexual abuse, verbal abuse. Is detrimental to our women in their mind. Eventually they don't respect their men and things like that and think their body is everything. They become a tool, a whore, a whoredom, a harlot, and it's destroying our women, it's destroying our families, because these women don't want to have families and things like that, but they're having kids everywhere and baby daddies everywhere and problem everywhere. Most of them are considered Jezebel figures because they're glorified and honored by men and people, as you see today. And these men are considered like Ahabs, weak, soft, effeminate men that have no balls and they have no hair on their chests and stuff. And I don't mean that physically, but I mean that mentally. They're oppressed by women and children and things like that. So scripture said all that would happen too in the end times. But they raped our women a lot back then and used them to lure men. Like they'll have you select out of a couple of women, choose one. Just like they used to sell us on the stock market, and sell us for money, and people will bid on us, and the white man will brokerage us like a house, without a mortgage. So, or guaranteed, they just import more Negroes and stuff, and then they had us working for no money. Now you got women that prostitute for money, strippers that strip for money, women that twerk on international television broadcast to the world twerking for money. And it's not what people think. It's raising a spirit of idolatry, adultery, fornication, which is porno, and as well as effeminate sodomite men, anal, and things like that, or women doing anal with toys, which is artificial intercourse and sexual activity. All these people done lost their natural desire for men, as women had lost their desire for men, and men lost their natural desire for women. So we're seeing all these things come true today in this time. Eventually, men is gonna be sleeping with robots, women with robots, and they'll make their whole entire body feel nearly as a man or nearly as a woman. They'll teach it certain languages to speak. They already got that stuff, robots and clones, like your phone talking back to you. But eventually, people will be engaging in sexual activities with robot, iron and clay, man and robot. And it's going to feel nearly like a human. So it's going to destroy even more families, because now you can just buy a robot and sleep with it. There's a movie for that, man. It's in my favorites on my YouTube page, on one of my 2 YouTube pages. But it talks about that, and it don't just talk about it. It's actually a movie, so it like shows you scenarios of what it could potentially be, and it doesn't look good. It looked like a genocide, because now some men are gonna turn into women, transgender, and women into men, and you won't know who is who, like Serena Williams and Michelle Obama. But things like that, it's gonna be very bad. And that guy Jenner, whatever his name, Bruce Jenner, whatever the dude's name is, and he's a dude, not a woman. Even if he'll try to run me over with his car or kill me for saying that, because everyone end up missing that. Talk about the Kardashians and all that stuff. Yeah, y'all know. But but my Father's power is greater and almighty. It's greater than theirs, and don't even compare. So all glory to Yahweh. So yeah, so they're deceiving our people, man. Even mixing white with black and telling you it's all fine. It's like Oreo and all that stuff. Black and white look beautiful together. All this is a way to kill us from being a pure, clean nation, unmixed, a holy nation set apart, a true vine, a true branch, and they're trying to mix us up with the heathen, so we don't know who we are. So you can see in the black culture, which they generalize us under, which we're not the same. We're not all black. Not all black people from the same tribe that was taken from the West Atlantic slave trade. But they in the black community, which they call us, which is a byword. They have our women twerking, shaking the butt, all this stuff, wearing tight hoochie pants, like prostitutes, like harlots, whoredom. You got pimps, men disrespecting our women, songs about fornication. I take this woman this, I take this woman that, I beat this up like this, I beat this up like that. How many times I gotta tell your girl to come over? Like things like that. They're putting fornication, adultery, cheating, being mischievous in our people's mind, and guess what? It's working. I can't find one girl in this world that I relate to, because they all serve the devil. Most of Jezebels, and trying to use seduction to try to bend men's will, as if looks is all there is, and not they're the last women to find in the earth. And some men act like that too sometimes. So like there's dysfunction in the house, and that's what I'm trying to say. This is why the root of sodomy, and the seed of sodomy, and the spirit of being sodomite, gay and lesbian and transgender is coming upon the people. And when they start using those robots, people will lose natural affections, and they'll have vile affections for robots and sex toys and vibrators and whatever you call the other stuff, and wanted to do things to their penis, like Horus, or Osiris, the whole penis story, or whatever his name is, I don't know, but that Egyptian story about the penis and all that stuff. These people are all about that obelisk. They're everywhere. They're all about sex, they're all about fertility, and they're all about reproduction. You know, that's why them Kim Kardashians are usually always pregnant by somebody or something. And they use these artists, these idols, these so-called stars or superstars, I call them fallen angels. They use them to deceive the mass with these shows, you know, with these propagandas. Oh, Kim Kardashian's pregnant again, or Beyonce's pregnant, and all that. But really, they're not really pregnant. It's a whole show. And when they are pregnant, it's because they made a deal with the devil to give up a baby before it's time and to sacrifice it. So they gotta like get pregnant and act like they're not pregnant at the same time, or be not pregnant because they can't give birth and like look like they're pregnant so they can adopt a baby and do some other junk. So Angelina Jolie buying Africans, you know, all that stuff is not a sign of good work or charity. They're trying to take these kids and teach them how to be gay and lesbian while they're young, and telling them in school that, you know, be yourself. Don't listen to your parents. Don't obey your parents, your mother, father. Be yourself, because you have the right to be yourself. They can't force their belief on you, which means our children shouldn't fight to know their roots and where they came from. So it's killing us, because we're repeating everything that Master used to make us do without Master being there now, when we have a chance to be free and truly emancipated by fighting against the enemy by uniting together. But right now we're divided, fighting each other, and what they used, just like Antiochus Epiphanes used, was religion. Because once they created religion, the bad Israelites started serving Zeus, Jesus, and the good Israelites stayed true to the Tanakh, to the Old Testament, and they got killed. You see, so that religion, Zeus, religion separates the people, and gangs separate people, camps separate people, all these groups separate people, because it segregates each person into what they identify as their own people. You see, into groups. So religion caused great problem amongst our people, man. So this video I'm about to show you will pretty much wrap it up before we begin our video for today. So pardon me for the long introduction, and also forgive me for the graphics because they kind of blur out certain parts because it's kind of sexually explicit, so parental guidance is advised. It's gonna show you the raw, you know, history of twerking and shaking your booty like a slut and pimping and all these foul, disgusting labels and words our people use to identify as being successful. So I'm no pimp, so I'd rather be a bum. Alright, continuing on.
We didn't know that they had these things called sex farms. And on these farms, grown white males would come and they could purchase our women. So they would come and our women would be used like merchandise. And they could come up and fill our women when they had no sense of their bodies and no ability to protect themselves. And they would always get a black male who was effeminized. No longer does he see himself as the protector of the black woman. And he would go around and say, hey, look what I got. Almost like a mannequin. Look,
like the girl was a product.
Look what she got available for you. Oh, these are the kind of things she does. Oh, do you want this one?
And during this time we were cursed. So that means we were in a daze, like we blacked out for 500 years, where we did not know who we are at all, and not even thought about it or spoken about it, like we were possessed by the devil for 500 years. Technically, because we had no control over our body. We had no control over our mind. We couldn't choose what we wanted to do with our children, and we got used to doing that. They told us not to read. They told us not to write. They told us not to learn. And not did they just tell us that, they killed some of us if we would read, write, or learn like I'm doing today. That's why a lot of Negroes don't like reading. They don't like picking up a book, because that's what the slave master have taught them. And they teach you that reading is only for white people, that black people don't read. They do rap, they do basketball and kick a ball around up and down like they're from Egypt, throwing a ball through a loop, which represented something going through a black hole, the earth going into a black hole. So they you know, our people strayed away a lot and stuff by following the white man. They had forgot their own roots, and they were completely disconnected from the I and I, from Yahuwah Elohim Zabaoth, and they had no control of their body. So you can say during that time we were possessed by the devil, and the women too, and they had no control over their body. They didn't know what a vagina was or a breast was. They didn't know what a period was really, because they didn't have a strong female model to view and learn from, like Mother Spirit and Mother Wisdom, Mother Knowledge, like the Pistis Sophia. They didn't have the young women didn't have a good motherly role model. You see? So they didn't know what to do. So men will come and rub up on the vajayjay and stuff and all that, and they start to giggle and they flirt back and forth, and then it's the easy way into their heart, easy way into their home, easy way into their pants. And the women fell for it. So they became a product of our own work after we accepted to become pimps over them, like Master used to be a pimp over them with the whip. So our women are deeply enslaved, and they're trying to cope with it by becoming masculine and manly and try to prove to us that they're like us. And now this is creating unhealthy competition, which does not edify but separates family. And the system supports the women, by the way. So if you try to be a man and stand up for yourself, be ready to be taken to jail on some rape charges like O.J. Simpson.
Oh, do you want this one?
Especially if she's white.
These are the type of things they did to us, but we had no control.
Especially if she's white, like Joseph and Pharaoh's wife. She kept trying to sleep with Joseph, and Joseph ran. He fled. She was a setup. So some of these women are set out like booby traps, like a mannequin, or like a beautiful statue or model, or like a Barbie doll, with blue eyes and blonde hair, like the Zeus you worship from Antiochus Epiphanes. But they turn our women into Jezebels, and they become so seductive, men can't even control themselves from fornicating, to the point they gotta make songs about it to Jezebel, as children of Ahab and Baal. I rebuke them.
Oh, these are the kind of things she does. Oh, do you want this one? Oh, do you want this one? These are the type of things they did to us, where we had no control over our own bodies, no control over what we did. And a black man didn't exist in the way he existed at home, where we protected our women and our children. No, we had to sit by on a day-to-day basis and watch them totally humiliate us. But not only did we watch them humiliate us, we had to participate in our own destruction and humiliation.
Yup, and to whip our own
brothers.
brothers.
These type of jobs where we could go around and show our women off. We began to
block off the
joy
feeling.
in doing them because we didn't feel that there was anything left. And so we were made into monsters. But right now.
So your own sexual desires and temptations and pleasure is being used against you. Against your sexual organ, against your heart, your stomach, your vision, you see what I'm saying? And from your throat. You see, so a lot of people are being sexually enhanced and hypersexualized to the point where like people can't even last a long time in bed too. Like 1 minute men, because they're so filled up with lust and desire. Once they come in, they come out. You know what I'm saying? Some people wanting to enlarge down there because the government is targeting down there, saying that if you're not a certain size, it won't be pleasurable. Saying that size is better than performance. Not that I'm trying to say that it's not, but our men's focus is on the wrong thing, so they're going out there having to prove they got the biggest ding dong for brain. And it's stupidity. It's animalistic. It's beastie. It's very basic minded, very simple. So now our guys are not really pimps of the women, but the pimps are the women are the pimps over the men, and men that see that use those women to pimp other men for their cash. You see, so our women are weapons, and they are the portal into the earth. We come from a womb. Whether spiritual, whether physical, we come from a womb, from a stomach. And Father Spirit, our Father puts us in the mother. It puts us in the earth. You see? So if the mother is unclean, the soil is unclean. You see? The children will grow up unclean, which mean wicked, greedy, vicious, robbers, thieves, carjackers, the criminals of today, the mafia, the government, things like that. They did not grow up with these type of principles and morals that we've grown up with, and we began to follow after their morals instead of keeping ours, because we couldn't find the beauty in ourselves that we were seeing in that blue-eyed, white-skinned, goat hair, blonde hair Jesus. You see, and when we seen him, we're like, hey, I want to be like that. I want to be peaceful. I want to be loving, not knowing that that very image was what was used to bring in false peace, false treaties, and false solutions, false safety that brought our true doom. You see? So they use false peace and false safety against you. Even when they say we're trying to secure the nation, national security, there's no such thing as national security. There is no security. All the borders and boundaries have been breached. And if anybody studies these extremities, you'll see at every point, in every path and route, these people have completely went backwards. The white man. And you guys want to be the best in that by going into their secret schools to learn their so-called secret arts, which is the promise of Lucifer and Satan for the divinity which you won't receive. You can't receive divinity or the Godhead like that. You know what I'm saying? You gotta only gain it through keeping the laws, statutes, and commandments of Yah, and He will bless you, barak you, and multiply you. You see, through His gifts, discernment, understanding, comprehension, empathy, love for one another, for brethren, for family, justice, knowing when to fight, knowing when to bring peace, knowing when to forgive, knowing when to stop, knowing when to go, knowing when to stand, knowing when to sit, knowing when to speak, knowing when to shut up. You got to get back in tune with the harmony and rhythm of what is, with the self-existing one, Yahuwah, because He is the harmony of what is, and He is the beginning of all that creates, that constructs. He's constructive energy, there to be tapped into, to tune into, and to constructively be used to bring peace, true peace upon earth through fighting, through warring for it. So it's like a medicine being put in the body to fight off cancer. You understand? So it's through the fighting we will be renewed, reborn. We must fight. So until then, we were passive. By tacit acquiescence, we were agreeing to all the terms and conditions that the white man was now presenting to us by implication, by our actions. Even if deep inside we did not want to comply, because we did, it is implied that we consented to all this. So now today we're being governed by consent, by our own choosing to not unite and assemble and create our own community for our people, by our people, like never before. So check this out.
The women is cool that he could come about women, but he likes things a little different. That's not really his taste. If it's going to be a female, he would prefer a little girl.
Yeah, little boys.
His development in the caves and hills of Europe. So they had sections of the sex farm with just little girls between the ages of 8 and 18. And they would dress the little girls in scantily dressed clothing and make the little girls dance around and gyrate. And while they would tell them to shake their behinds, and they would always have the most well-dressed black male on the sex farm. He had his high hat and his suit. He was the best-dressed brother in the place.
Like a pimp.
He would stand there with the sisters and he would gyrate while these little girls would gyrate and show their bodies off for these grown white males to come and purchase them. And this is the kind of thing that we went. I know we're so far removed from slavery that we can't really imagine no black man standing around gyrating, showing our sisters off, little girls and our women, as some type of sex objects for grown males, dressing our little girls up as if they're some type of
all our
sex
children
market or what have you. I know we're so far.
And as you can tell right there, there's no white Jews there with us. There's no Spanish, Puerto Rican people there with us. It is nothing but Negroes. So this is a key point to finding out the children of Israel, is that they were black people of black lineage, and there was no white or mutt or mix in them. And their God, the God of Israel, gave them command to not mix with the nations round about them. Therefore the seed and the language and certain things of our tradition has been preserved. And Judah and Levi and Ephraim, the children of Judah, Yis-RoyAl, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we are the children of Israel. Not the pale skinned Puerto Ricans or Dominicans, but the black people in that land. And I do not say to judge a book based on its cover, but everyone needs to do a blood test, because those of darker skin are more closely and more likely to be Hebrew than those of lighter skin, which were given privileges by the white man because they were whiter than the blacks, and so the whites wanted the light-skinned blacks to fight with the dark-skinned blacks and all that stuff, so they can wipe out each other while they stay pure blood white. That's why they call themselves the royal family, the pure blood family. They're pure blood, cold blood reptilian, man. Children of the winter, children of the dark, children of the fall, ball. I rebuke them in Yahuwah's name. There's no balling over here. So, all these little children you see right here are all black people, Negroes. You see? Ça c'est ça moun blanc yo te kon fè nou longtemps, ap fè nou vendre femme nou lan prostituée, nan tout bagay kon sa ap vendre femme nou. Jodia wè san Haiti paske moun yo pa chanje racine yo pa chanje zanzet yo pa chanje grand-papa yo. So peut-être ça y a fait ça moun blanc te montre yo, les catholiques chrétiens te vini à Zeus, net le yo te vini avec quelques mode bagay yo te kon ap fait, ton kou ap vendre femme nou, n'avait couché avec yon ba force ka déjà. So kounya femme nou fè li pou kob, men longtemps yo te kon force yo pou fè li pou gratis, pendant nèg nou tap tiye moun blanc. Je da nou vin zami avec moun blanc. Nou vin bli en pile bagay, nou vin tourner esclave encore avec faux la paix, avec faux sécurité. So, and you continue.
Removed from the slave plantation that our minds can't fathom that. But I want you just to try to imagine being so effeminized that you don't see yourself as the protector of your women. Instead, you see yourself as the salesman of the sexual exploits for our women. I want you to imagine being in a circumstance like that. Can you imagine, black man, standing before the world saying, here are our women. Look at her shake her thing. Look at her show herself. She's really a sexual object. Do you want her? How much you want to pay for this one? Well, brothers and sisters, we got to be real careful, because we don't watch it.
Yeah, and it's messed up because this dude Chingy is supposedly working with GOCC, which claim that they're the gathering of Christ Church, but obviously they're a blasphemy and an I am complex of the white man. To a very great degree, they're branches of them. Although I learned a lot from them in the past, like IUIC with the Rosicrucianists, but Chingy was working with them, and he likes sleeping with transgenders. They're bisexual, and as you can tell, they got our women, black women, dark-skinned Hebrews dancing in the back, twerking and shaking their booty like a Nelly video or a 50 Cent premiere. Not knowing that they're showcasing their body to the world. So I believe that what Miley Cyrus been doing about the whole twerking phenomena is actually a racist, prejudice, discriminative, slave code noir type of of subliminal. And I feel like they're trying to let us know that they remember that they believe that they're above us, and they remember what they did to our people, and they'll never forget what they did to us, because the day they do, they will be killed. If we remember and they don't. So they try to keep us from remembering so they can continue to benefit from our work and labor, because we built all the country and built all the earth through slavery, so we don't reclaim those lands they took from us. Stay asleep, just watch music, play video games, watch television, go to school, sit in church, and never read any parts of the Bible that tell you bad things, because that's negative. Oh yeah, love your enemy and love the authority, the government. This is all Christianity, Catholic, man. It's a brainwash, and it's been sore and grievous upon us. So yeah, you see most of these people, doing the same thing that slave master used to make us do back then. So we're still enslaved.
We might find ourselves having our women being faceless and nameless, gyrate so careful, because we don't watch it. But we think we will. faceless and nameless, gyrating before the world as the sexual tools for the Europeans. See, Negroes always talk about slavery being over, but Negroes
So they
don't
mocking
read,
us,
so the
white
Negroes
and
don't
black.
know what slavery was. And if you don't know what slavery was, and if you don't know what happened during slavery, Negro, you don't know when it's over.
Even the balding up of your head. They used to cut your locks on purpose to whatchamacallit, to disgrace you and dishonor you, because your locks is considered like a crown. You see what I'm saying? Your locks. And this represents roots. You see, like the root of life, the root of tree, the root of David. So they used to cut our hair, the men's hair and the women's hair, and bald it. Now our women, their hair can't really grow back, and you got a lot of our men now who got bald head, like Michael Jackson and Mr. Clean, and things like that. Even the earrings too. The whole concept of earrings, branding someone, or the chain around your neck used to represent a yoke, like a chain of iron, like shackles, and handcuffs. So people wear chains, which is reflective of that. They wear crosses on these chains, which represents the bondage of Christianity, of the Catholics, of the Gothic people, the ones who hung Yahusha on a tree, Hollywood. So all these people are part of that Boule, COINTEL, CIA infiltrated, infiltration of our people and culture, where you have these corrupt black people who are sent out into the world to deceive, to lie, to defame, to slander, to make look bad, to be called by wrong name, to make us be mocked. You see, they're sent out there to make us look bad, to kill blacks, or cause blacks to kill blacks, but not one of them are violent really. They're all softer than cushion. And plus, if they were really truly violent, the white man above them wouldn't allow them to get the $1 million covenant, the $1 million deal. Because you'll see that they're a threat to their kingdom and would not help them build their kingdom. So when Satan chooses people, he chooses them wisely. He observes you, he watches you, he studies you, then he comes to you with all types of promises and gifts of good life and millionaire and be famous. And if you sell your soul, he'll give you all this. It's a lie. It's a I am complex. It's biting into the forbidden apple, and it's pretty much giving yourself over to the kingdom of Satan. So these people are going to hell. They know it. That's why they believe in the motto called YOLO, which means you only live once, and swag. Secretly, we are gay, because they have to be anally penetrated and broken through before they're let in. They got to make sure that they're loyal and that they can blackmail them at some point. So they videotape the sexual acts and various things, even sleeping with kids or peeing in a little girl's mouth or sleeping with little boys. They film these things and they say, if you tell anybody anything, we're going to expose you. We're going to make you look crazy. We're going to make you look like a drug addict, and we're going to kill you, and no one's going to do anything about it. So if you break this oath and you begin to talk, expect to die. So these people try to speak out, like Michael Jackson and Kennedy and Tupac and Biggie and things like that and more, and they kill him. They kill him. So there's a group of demonic, wicked witches and wizards out there building a great empire right now within our government, or within the government, and they're ready anytime now to do a mass sacrifice for Satan and come kill many black people and whites and everything. So someone's coming, and our Father sees our affliction. He will come to fight against them for us. These people right here, if they do not repent quickly and come to the Most High Power, they too shall perish, with the 2/3 going to Sheol. See, look at them. They think they're living right. Secretly, they are gay.
Having our women being faceless and nameless, gyrating before the world as the sexual tools for the Europeans. See, Negroes always talk about slavery being over, but Negroes don't read, so the Negroes don't know what slavery was. And if you don't know what slavery was, and if you don't know what happened during slavery, Negro, you don't know when it's over. How do you know when it's over? How do you know when it's over?
And by the way, all that booty be hurting their lower back sometimes. A lot of women with that type of booty and stuff end up having back problems. So that's another thing they're not telling you. And they're making you want to change your body through surgery and Botox and breast implant, butt implant, lip implant, nip tuck. They want you to do facelifts and all that stuff like you playing Mario Kart. So they try to change us and mold us and inject us and vaccinate us, drug us, keep us distracted, busy, listening to junk music, listening to pastors who's not telling you what I tell you, people who don't tell you about your race. They don't tell you about your race and all that in school. They tell you it don't matter, but yet they know their own race and people, and it matters very much for them, but yet tell us that, be yourself, it don't matter. So America is becoming a type of Babylon for the Hebrews, and so is Ahiti with the Haitians that do voodoo, which come from Catholicism. So all that came from the image of the so-called saints. In Creole, they call them Loa. That's not good. They're demons. You see, those images of Jesus and Saint Patrick and Mary and all that.
I know you can't.
Look at that. This is a mockery.
Selling our women to white slavery being over. But Negroes don't read. So the Negroes don't know what slavery was. And if you don't know what slavery was, and if you don't know what happened during slavery, Negro, you don't know when it's over. How do you know when it's over? How do you know when it's over? I mean, can you imagine? I know you can't. Us selling our women to white males and they can buy her like bread in the exchange, going to the market, and she's some meat that can just be bought and sold.
That's your little children.
That's where we've been, but see, we've forgotten. So consequently, all of the damage that was done to us during this time has us in a state now, a very frightening state, where we actually see it as acceptable to show our women
like she's meat.
We did on those sex farms and sexual toilets and play toys for white males or anybody who wants them. That's an effeminized black male.
Yeah.
Because he's been stripped of the inside that made him a man. That told him that it's my.
Exactly. Like Christians turn the boys gay because the men don't hunt, they don't fish, they don't take care of their family. And on top of that, they don't know how to protect their family, because in Christianity they teach you to turn the other cheek and to forgive white men, your enemy, and don't fight. So the white man is raping our women while the black man just sit there saying, well, Jesus is gonna come anytime, and Jesus never come. And then our people are raped, and when white people do come and we think it's Jesus, they come with guns to try to take our land, like Napoleon tried to do at Haiti and Christopher Columbus with the Americas. So we have a recycling history of being oppressed by this peaceful looking white man. There's this image of this peaceful white man that never ever existed. This is the face of the peaceful people, and them they were being abused, misused, and taunted because they were not evil. You see, so our people are kind people, loving people. If we were evil, we would have killed the white man instead of do what he told us. The white man is evil. You see? So our children are the victims. Our women could have been your mom, could have been your daughter. These are our people, and they're the ones who's crying out in the dirt, in the soil, saying that it was the white man that did it to us. Don't forget, it was the white man. They're crying, their blood in the dirt, in the grave, crying. Tell them, don't forget. Honor us. Don't let us down. Don't ever forget what they did to us, so when the day come, we can avenge the blood that was spilled in the name of justice, in the spirit of justice.
Our job to protect our women. I want you to imagine where that leaves us, brothers and sisters. What gets us in this condition that we're doing today? Negro. Where we are today is where we were yesterday. And we think that we've come a long way because we don't know the sexual types of things they were doing. And consequently, we're destroying ourselves before the world. We're telling the world that we want to be destroyed. We're telling the world that our women are here for sexual exploit. That's what they're here for. And we're not men because we're not here to protect them. We're here as salesmen to sell them to you. And I want you to look at these images because they're the same images. But it gets even worse because, you know, the cracker, you know, little girls is cool, you know, grown females are cool, but his highest and noblest aspiration to be with that little boy. That's right. I mean, that's where it all started from. I should say the beginning of it was with the little boy. So if you went on a slave plantation, the white males who really wanted to get down and dirty, they would go to a different section of the slave plantation. They would go to the section of the plantation with the little boys. And our little boys would be dressed up in earrings and makeup. And the white male would go around, oh, this is the one I like, and they would be made to act as females.
And messed up our boys.
Females. And the whites would oil our bodies up, the little boys up, and put the makeup on them, and the earrings, and sell them on the meat market. This is the feminization of black people where the whites begin to see us through their own sick, sordid eyes.
That's a disorder. So they've been trained to be gay. They've been trained to be transgender. They've been trained to be bisexual. Naturally, according to nature, how Yah made man, they were not born that way. So there's a spirit in them telling them inside that, hey, I'm not a man, I'm a woman. Let me start wearing dresses. Let me start wearing makeup. Let me start wearing earrings and things like that. That's the spirit of sodomy. And Obama pushes it heavily through the system, and Michelle Obama is a man. You see, a transgender, a perfected work or art, just like Serena Williams and Venus Williams have balls. They are men, you see. So they have done that to us. The people have been trained to become gay, and they've been also told as comfort that it's them being themselves. Be yourself. So our children are not understanding why this is extremely bad and genocidal. And it's going to cancel out our race because we can't multiply men and men, women with women, and humans with robots. You see? So we're dying. But there will be 144,000 remnants saved. These children will have to learn how to unlearn what they learn. You know, to undo. But most of them will never get out of it because the spirit of sodomy and the spirit of whoredom is very strong. It's a very strong demonic dark force, literally, causing them to go back to sodomy, going back to fornication, and going back to prostitution, you see? So you see that today in hip hop. That's why they have to anally sodomize you when you become a Freemason or in Illuminati to break your spirit, your manhood. And that's why they get all these tattoos all over their body to feel like men, because they've been defiled. They've been anally rammed and sometimes ran through, and sometimes they have to actually suck the whole crew's part, the shaft of Horus, or Osiris. So they take pictures of this and they videotape it, so if the man try to get out, they'll tell the people that they're gay and they'll expose them. So now they sold their soul, they gave up everything, and they cannot get out. So a lot of them artists that you see on television today will not make it to heaven. They will burn in hell. And those who follow them and have pleasure in what they do, or even masturbate to what they do, which is the bait of master, they shall be caught up in the pit and the snare and wide path and destruction of hell as well, when Yahusha comes back for his vengeance. So unfortunately, these kids right here have been corrupt. They gotta go. So know that Hebrews will be going too, but this is what Hebrews look like, and they're my skin color.
And then we begin, under the system of slavery, to act those very things out. These are the things that did to us. And so, can you imagine black men, us walking crackers around, showing off black males and black children as sexual objects to the world? This is what we did. Our little girls are little boys. So our whole minds are being devastated. And like I said, if you don't know where you've been, then you can't quite recognize where you are. Can you imagine today that we can take children and make them look like they're adults, ready for sexual exploit, and be acting these things out before the world and saying little black babies are really
Yeah, they definitely had a specific job for them boys, and that was to turn them effeminate like Obama is today, a product of the beast. So this is a cool video to check out right here. I'm not going to play any part of it, but this right here, they go in. They go in. It's called the Transatlantic Slave Trade. What did lead to an African participation? Because even Moors also participated in our slavery. I won't show that in this video. I will in the series though, when I start talking about Islam. So that may be in the next video or the second after that. So alright, we're going to begin our lesson for today with continuing on slavery in America. Oh, pardon me. Put some soft sounds on. Alright. So I hope y'all are ready to learn today. So slavery in Africa. So you may want to take a look at this picture. Hold on one sec. So alright, yeah. Because our people are being exported over here around Ethiopia and all that stuff is as well by the Arabians right here in Mecca, and all the way up here to the Saharan desert, and our people are being exported right here in South and Central West Africa. There's no such thing as a Christian Ethiopia. There goes Aden. The Garden of Eden is around this area. India and all that stuff. Alright, let's see, put this down. So yeah, we go back to like ancient times. Like real ancient times. We ancient people. Don't you feel it in your bones? Don't you feel yourself? And I'm talking about in a healthy way, not in a slave mentality or masturbating way, which is the bait of master. How he fished for blacks is through sexual exploitation and tension. So the main slave routes in medieval Africa. So this article discusses systems, history, and effects of slavery within Africa. See Arab slave trade, Atlantic slave trade, Ma'afa, and slavery in contemporary Africa for other discussions. Very important. So continuing on. So you see this Arab right here? These are all Africans or Hebrews. And you got the Arabs right here, the Edomites, who are enslaving us right there. The Ishmaelite, the Edomites. So a Zani slave gang in Zanzibar, a Zani slave gang. So slavery in Africa has not only existed throughout the continent for many centuries, but still continues in the current day in some countries. Systems of servitude and slavery were common in parts of the continent, as they were in much of the ancient world. So in most African societies where slavery was prevalent, the enslaved people were not treated as cattle slaves and were given certain rights in a system similar to indentured servitude, which is insured servitude, elsewhere in the world. So when the Arab slave trade and Atlantic slave trade began, many of the local slave systems changed and began supplying captives for slave markets outside of Africa. Slave markets, slave systems in the Arab slave trade and Atlantic slave trade. So slavery in historical Africa was practiced in many different forms, different formats, and some of these do not clearly fit the descriptions of slavery elsewhere in the world. Debt slavery, enslavement of war captives, military slavery, and criminal slavery, prisoners, were all practiced in various parts of Africa. So that's where that whole idea comes from. So forms of slavery. So multiple forms of slavery and servitude have existed throughout Africa, during history, and were shaped by indigenous practices of slavery, as well as the Roman institution of slavery and the later Christian views on slavery. The Islamic institutions of slavery, and eventually the Atlantic slave trade. So we've been enslaved by the Christians, by the Muslims, and the Atlantis slave trade. Atlantic. So slavery existed in parts of Africa like the rest of the world, and was a part of the economic structure of some societies for many centuries, although the extent varied. So Ibn Battuta, who visited the ancient kingdom of Mali in the mid-14th century, recounts that the local inhabitants varied with each other in the number of slaves and servants they have, and was himself given a slave boy as a hospitality gift, enslaving someone else as a gift. That's messed up. So in sub-Saharan Africa, the slave relationships were often complex, with rights and freedoms given to individuals held in slavery and restrictions on sale and treatment by their masters. So many communities and hierarchies between different types of slaves, for example, differentiating between those who had been born into slavery and those who had been captured through war. Because we were being captured through war, and some were born into slavery. Of Ham, bondage, the curse of Cain, Ham. So the slaves in Africa, I suppose, are nearly in proportion of 3 to 1 to the freemen. So I suppose are nearly in the proportion of 3 to 1 to the freemen. So they claim no reward for their services except food and clothing, and are treated with kindness or severity according to the good or bad disposition of their masters. So custom, however, has established what? Certain rules with regard to the treatment of slaves, so which it is thought dishonorable to violate. So they had rules to it. So thus the domestic slaves, or such as are born in a man's own house, are treated with more lenity than those which are purchased with money. So, but these restrictions on the power of the master extended not to the care of prisoners taken in war, nor to that of slaves purchased with money. So all these unfortunate beings are considered as strangers and foreigners who have no right to the protection of the law and may be treated with severity or sold to a stranger according to the pleasure of their owners. That's why Benin and Dahomey, these people in this area, sold a lot of black people. Benin and things like that. Dahomey, as well as the Moors from the Saharan. So they had certain black tribes or groups that were slave owners. We see signs of this in America too, where there were Negroes, free Negroes that had black slaves, and they keep saying that the Moors were in America before the Israelites, but not before the Indians, because the Moors were helping the Spanish in Spain and things like that in their voyages, since they were navigators of the seas and stuff like that. So the Moors were already in America, brought from Spain, and a lot of them been deported as well after they fell. So when Africans came in, Africans and Moors didn't really get along, because Moors already had like rights, like free rights in America. They were helping master and slave the Hebrew Israelite African. Just like you see today, the Moorish Americans, the Moors working side by side with the Americans, and Ish meaning man, so man of Morocco, of the Saharan up here. So travels in the interior of Africa, Mongol Park, travels in the interior of Africa, war and slavery. So slavery in African cultures was generally more like indentured servitude, which as if it was insured, like you had some assurance. Although in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, slaves were used for human sacrifices and annual rituals, like with the Mayans and with the Incas and with Stonehenge and things like that, Machu Picchu, Sedona, Arizona, the pyramids, and certain things like that. These were altars, places of sacrifice and ceremony, either animal or human. So some of these Africans in sub-Sahara use human for sacrifice and annual rituals, such as those rituals practiced by the denizens of Dahomey. Exactly. And some of them people were brought into Ahiti too. Either they were from that tribe, or they were holding people captive, prisoners of war, and they sold them to the white man. And I'm pretty sure our people destroyed a lot of the Dahomey tribes, because they're the roots of a lot of the voodoo, and we're against that stuff, witchcraft and all that. But not all of them were like that. Many of them were priests, and but yeah. So the denizens of Dahomey mixed with Congo, Yoruba, and the Taino voodoo. So slaves were often not the cattle of other men, nor enslaved for life. But when we got enslaved by the white man, we became cattle, and they're trying to enslave us for life. So the forms of slavery in Africa were closely related to kinship structures. So it was mainly related to kinship, hierarchy, the family. If you're family, we don't do that to you. That's a rule. But if you're the enemy, then we can sell you off, onto the enemy. So some Africans were against us too. Hamites, Japhetics, and Arabs from Shem, Ishmaelites, which eventually became Edomites, Hittite, Hivite, Canaanite, and Ishmaelite mix, Mutts, Arab they call it in Hebrew. Arab mean mix, a mixed people like America. So in many African communities where land could not be owned, enslavement of individuals was used as a means to increase the influence a person had and expand connections. So they use it to increase the influence the person had on people. The white man or the Arabs had on the community and people. They like the power, they like the recognition. And so they can expand connections and to build COINTEL infiltrators within groups to get information and all that stuff. I like this little legend chart right here. So this made slaves a permanent part of a master's lineage, and the children of slaves could become closely connected with the larger family ties. So children of slaves born into families could be integrated into the master's kinship group and rise to prominent positions within society. So that's how some dark-skinned people were able to move up, because the master's house that they lived in, they had a lot of recognition and honor and respect among the people. So Negroes that were cool with these white people and masters, and they loved master to death, rose up in prominent positions, and they were less strict on them, and they were getting licenses and permissions and stuff to do certain things that other blacks would not be able to do, or would have been stopped on those wagons or killed or shot or rifled or something, And they do beat up black people, they use black people to beat black people. So children of black people, Hebrews, born into families of white people, could be integrated into the master's kinship group and rise to prominent positions within society, like Joseph and Pharaoh. So even to the level of chief president, in some instances, like Yahusaf. So, however, stigma often remain attached, and there could be strict separations between slave members of a kinship group and those related to the master. So, cattle slavery. So, cattle slavery is a specific servitude relationship where the slave or the Negro is treated as the property of the owner, like through the birth certificate and social security card. The owner is the United States and the Federal Reserve Bank of the Vatican in England, which is the whole Knight Templar, Malta, the Knights of Malta, Skull and Bone, Bilderberg, Rockefeller, family branches, the Rothschilds, the children of Roth, from the Caucasus Mountain, Georgia up there, Byzantine, Macedonia, all that stuff. So those white people, those white devils, their bank own America, and they own Negroes through birth certificate and social security cards, pledges, and promissory notes, like pledging a house. And if you don't pay off the debt, they foreclose on the house, like putting your body in jail if you don't show up in court the way you promised that you would appear next week by signing that ticket. I promised to appear next week. So they put a warrant out, a warranty deed upon your body like a product, and put you in jail and put you in a gym, like a storage house for a product. So you see, slavery today is masked as code noir, or code of law, color of law, de facto law, which that promises all these type of remedies and cures that is not even for us. It's for white people. And the Constitution in America is dead anyway, so there is no more white people. There's only the Europeans versus the Hebrews and the Indians of the land still, like it was in the beginning. But there's more whites now. And been successful at taking over certain countries and industrializing them, like the North. So as such, the owner is free to sell, trade, or treat the slave or the product, the cattle, the social birth certificate, as he would other pieces of property. And the children of the slave, your children which you pledged to the birth certificate, often are retained as the property of the master of the Federal Reserve Vatican Bank. the children of Bohemian Grove and Jekyll Island. So there is evidence of long histories of cattle slavery in the Nile River Valley and northern Africa. But evidence is incomplete about the extent and practices of cattle slavery throughout much of the rest of the continent prior to written records by Arab or European traders. Because those are our enemy: Catholic, Christian, Muslim. And Muslim came from Hindu. So did Buddhists. Buddha and all that came from Hindu. That came from India, the false Indians. That's where Arab, the mix, the mutts came from. Mix of Egyptian, Hagar, and whatever else. With Shemite, Hebrew, Abram. So domestic service. So many slave relationships in Africa revolved around domestic slavery, domestic slave, domestic violence, like a domestic dog. So where slaves would work primarily in the house of the master, so the housemaster has domestic slaves, which they call house niggers, or children of the of the children of the providence, or children of the parliament, or federal babies, governmental babies, bastards. So they called them domestic slaves, the house of the master, non-domestic without the U.S. But retained some freedoms. So they retained some freedoms, like under statute law, Uniform Commercial Code law, statutes, procedures, and practices. So domestic slaves, house niggers, could be considered part of the master's household and would not be sold to others without extreme cause. So the slaves could own the profits from their labor, whether in land or in products, and could marry and pass the land on to their children in many cases. So that's wild that they had that happening. A great loyalty between house niggers and house masters, house slaves and house masters, house servants, workers, and their boss man, employer. So pawnship or debt bondage slavery, like Egypt again, slaves and ships, slavery and ships. So involves the use of people as collateral, like a security agreement, like a pawn, like a product, a vessel, to secure the repayment of debt. So they use our body too as faith and credit of their system, of the United States or wherever we be, Babylon. We are the faith and credit of the country. Our tax money is the funds, the mutual funds, the municipal funds that they are using to extort us through and causing us to acquire debt through their borrowing practices, which creates liabilities. Like a dollar bill is nothing but liability. So debt slavery, liability slavery. Slave labor is performed by the debtor, like today, debtor, or a relative of the debtor, usually a child. So pawnship was a common form of collateral in West Africa, especially for trading services and time and energy for work, for products. We can work for something, So the body would be used as collateral. Your time, energy, and your strength. Wow. So it involved the pledge of a person. So it involved the pledge of your body, like signing a ticket. You pledge the body for arrest. You submit the body to the conditions of being arrested, confiscated, or taken, like a warranty, like a guarantee. If you do not come to court next week like you promised, That's why they coerce you under duress to sign tickets and stuff, so that you're liable for your premise. So if you don't come to court next week, they can put a warranty deed on the body and sell it to somebody, like investors, and stuff like that, like when they used to sell us in Wall Street in New York, York. So they can invest in your case or invest in you like a product or a cattle, and they can also buy you too, for time, labor, and energy through the birth certificate and social security number and the private routing number and serial number on the back of that card, or the QSIP numbers to keep track of the product, or the bond, the glue, the pledge. So it involved the pledge of a person or a member of that person's family to service another person, providing credit. So credit, that's how we get this credit-based system. And that began in West Africa, the Uniform Commercial Code. Or the Uniform Bartering Code or Trading Code. So pawnship was related to, yet distinct from, slavery in most conceptually, because the arrangement could include limited, specific terms of services to be provided, and because kinship ties would protect the person from being sold into slavery. So pawnship was a common practice throughout West Africa prior to European contact, including amongst the Akan people and the U people, the Ga people, the Yoruba people, and the Ido or Igbo people. In modified forms, it also existed amongst the Efik people, the Igbo people, the Ija people, and the Fan people. All these people are from over here, this area. Ido, Yoruba, Ga. I'm not sure where Ga is right now. Where are you, Ga? But they also got Afrique right here, Afrique people, Afrique. Also that reminds me of Hebrew. And as you can tell, where's Ija? So Igbo, Igala, Fan, where Fan? I see Ful, I see Fang. Oh, there goes Fan. Okay, I see. So you can look deeper into that if you like. Let's look for Akon real quick and I'll continue on. If I don't find it, I'll leave it, because there's so much places here. Alright, I can't find Akon on there right now, but let's continue on. Oh yeah, and this would be the Niger River. So this, descended all the way down here. All these rivers. Remember the Most High said that the Garden of Eden is split into rivers. I'm not saying it's around here, because I know it's around here and near Ethiopia. But yeah, keep an eye on these rivers and stuff like that. Especially the Euphrates that run through Turkey, down, all the way down to the garden, Ethiopia and all that. So military slavery. So what is military slavery? And there goes our people again, enslaved. So slaves for sacrifice at the annual customs of Dahomey. So the Dahomey used to sacrifice slaves a lot. So from the history of Dahomey, an inland kingdom of Africa, 1793. So blacks enslaving blacks. So military slavery involved the acquisition and training of unscripted military units, which would retain the identity of military slaves even after their service. So slave soldier groups would be run by a patron who could be the head of a government or an independent warlord, and who would send his troops out for money and his own political interests. So this was most significant in the Nile Valley, primarily in Sudan and Uganda. So with slave military units organized by various Islamic authorities, and with the war chiefs of Western Africa, with the war chiefs, the war leaders in Africa, like Benin and things like that. As you can tell, the Berbers, Arabic, all that stuff is all dumb. Nilo-Saharan is parts of these yellow. You got the Niger-Congo B, the orange section. You got the Niger-Congo A, this right here, Yoruba, Igbo, Fulani, someday homie, and stuff like that. And you can continue looking at that if you choose. So the military units in Sudan were formed in the 1800s. Through large-scale military raiding in the area, which is currently the countries of Sudan and South Sudan. And I believe there was a lot of Europeans there. A lot of Ethiopians and Hebrews there too, potentially. But I don't know. And Dan remind me of Dan. So slaves for sacrifice. Hebrew Israelites for sacrifice, like in the Mayans and all that. So although archaeological evidence is not clear on the issue prior to European contact, in those societies that practiced human sacrifice, slaves became the most prominent victims. And they do that in Illuminati and things like that too. So slaves for sacrifice. So we read that. So local slave trade. So several nations such as the Ashanti of present-day Ghana, and the Yoruba of present-day Nigeria were involved in slave trading. Wow. So they were involved in slave trading. Groups such as the Imbangala of Angola and the Nyamwezi of Tanzania. So groups such as the Imbangala of Angola, the Nyamwezi of Tanzania would serve as intermediaries or roving bands, waging war on African states to capture people for export as slaves. So that would be Ashanti, parts of Ghana, and the Yoruba of present-day Nigeria were involved in slave trading. Groups as these from Angola and Tanzania. And they would serve as intermediaries in waging war on African states to capture people for export as slaves. So historians John Thornton and Linda Haywood have provided an estimate that Africans captured and then sold to Europeans around 90% of those who were shipped in the Atlantic slave trade. So Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard Chair of African and African American Studies, have stated that without complex business partnerships between African elites and European traders and commercial agents, the slave trade to the New World would have been impossible. Without complex business partnerships with African elites So the African kings, a lot of the Hamites, they caused this to our people. And European traders and commercial agents, the slave trade to the New World, especially with the Islamic people. Without that, it would have been impossible, at least on the scale it occurred. So our people were part of our own enslavement, technically. Although we're not Hamite or Japhetic or Arabs, we're specifically from Jacob. That's the root. Jacob, Israel, prevailing with Yah, Yis-RoyAl, upright with Al. So in regards to the indigenous slave trade, Dr. Akurang Pari has said that the viewpoint that Africans enslaved Africans is obfuscating, if not troubling. The development of African in African history tends to coalesce into obscurantist obstructions of identity. So the deployment of African in African history tends to coalesce into obscurantist constructions of identities that allow scholars, for instance, to subtly call into question the humanity of all Africans. So they had labeled us African as a general term. They generalized us and prejudged against us by calling us all African. That's a confusing word. That's a byword in proverb, like Jamaican, African American, Indian, as well as Haitian, Cuban, all this stuff. That was not our names. We've been divided. But it helps them to construct identities by obscurantist. So it helped them to coalesce into obscurantist constructions of identities, generalization, so that those who study us can just subtly call into question black people or Africans as one. That's why we get the name African American and black. They generalizing us. So whenever Asante rulers sold Asantes into slavery, they did not construct it in terms of Africans selling fellow Africans. They looked at it as certain tribes selling certain tribes. So you got to get a blood test. So they saw the victims for what they were. For instance, as Akuapems, without categorizing them as fellow Africans. For what they were, for instance, as Akuapems, without categorizing them as fellow Africans. So it categorized us under a New World name, a New World Order type of name. So Africans, equally when Christian Scandinavians and Christian Russians sold war captives to the Islamic people of the Abbasid Empire. So they didn't think that they were placing fellow Europeans into slavery. So Christians are European. The Spanish. So this lazy categorizing homogenizes Africans. So it homogenizes Africans and has become a part of the methodology of African history, of grouping us up and claiming that we're all from one people. That's a lie. They're trying to wipe us out from being a nation, Psalms 83. So not surprisingly, the Western media's cottage industry on Africa has tapped into it to frame Africans in inchoate generalities. So they're framing us in generalities, allowing the media to describe local crisis in one African state as African problem, black people, black lives, all that stuff. That's the New World term. So I'll be careful with calling myself black. So a slave market in Cairo, 1848, the headquarters of the Brotherhood in Islam. Obama went there to go make a speech. The Brotherhood of the Muslims. And Obama's over us right now as a Muslim, Saharan king, African Saharan king, and he's mixed with European. So slavery practices throughout Africa. So like most other regions of the world, slavery and forced labor existed in many kingdoms and societies of Africa for thousands of years, since Egypt, the first greatest kingdom before Babylon. So precise evidence on slavery or the political and economic institutions of slavery before contact with the Arab or Atlantic slave trade is not available. So early European reports of slavery throughout Africa in the 1600s are unreliable because they often conflated various forms of servitude as equal to cattle slavery. So there's different forms of slavery, but they conflated various forms of servitude as equal to cattle slavery. So the complex relationships and evidence from oral histories often incorrectly describe many forms of servitude or social status as slavery, even when the practices do not follow conceptualizations of slavery in other regions around the world. So the best evidence of slave practices in Africa come from the major kingdoms, particularly along the coast, and there is little evidence of widespread slavery practices in stateless societies. So this was happening near the coast of Africa in the west, not in the east. Not like that, but it did happen in the east too. But most of the blacks selling blacks were near the coast, so they can be hauled on ships and things like that. So slave trading was mostly secondary to other trade relationships. However, there is evidence of a trans-Saharan slave trade route from Roman times, which persisted in the area after the fall of the Roman Empire of the Iron Age. Now we're in the clay, the age of the clay, which is the Ottoman Empire. So, however, kinship structures and rights provided to slaves, except those captured in war, appears to have limited the scope of slave trading before the start of the Arab slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade, except those captured in war. So who are they warring with? And you can see why a lot of African tribes today don't like other African tribes, or they try to generalize us and stuff or something, which causes problems amongst our people, because then we have heathens in the camp. So Northern Africa. So redemption of Christian slaves by Catholic monks in Algiers in 1661. So Christians had slaves, black slaves, like today. We already know about Rome, the Catholic. So cattle slavery had been legal and widespread throughout North Africa when the region was controlled by the Romans, 47 BC through 500 AD. So the Sahel region south of the Sahara Desert provided many of the African slaves held in North Africa during this period, and there was a trans-Saharan slave trade in operation. So Muslims got us too. So cattle slavery persisted after the fall of the Roman Empire and the largely Christian communities of the region. So after the Islamic expansion into most of the region, the practices continue. So Islam, the Moors, all that in Spain, in Europe. So into most of the region, The practices continued, and eventually the cattle form of slavery spread to major societies on the southern end of the Sahara, such as Mali, Songhai, and Ghana. They were involved in selling black people, I believe. I gotta study more into that. So the medieval slave trade in Europe was mainly to the east and south. The Christian Byzantine Empire, which was in Constantinople, Istanbul, Turkey, and the Muslim world, were the destinations. Central and Eastern Europe, an important source of slaves, like in Turkey. Combination of Muslim, African, Hittites with with the Europeans, the Christians, and stuff like that in Constantine, Byzantine, Istanbul, the bull of Bashan. So slavery in medieval Europe was so widespread that the Roman Catholic Church repeatedly prohibited it, or at least the export of Christian slaves to non-Christian lands was prohibited at, for example, the Council of Koblenz in 922, the Council of London, Land of Dan, in 1102, and the Council of Armagh in 1171, which also remind me of the Council of Nicaea. So because of religious constraints, the slave trade was monopolized in parts of Europe by Iberian Jews, known as Radhanites. I don't know what in the world that means. Who were able to transfer slaves from pagan Central Europe through Christian Western Europe. 2 Muslim countries in Al-Andalus and Africa. So many Slavian slaves, Christians were enslaved. Well, many Slavs were enslaved for so many centuries that word slave or Slav became synonymous with slavery. That's where that came from, Slavic. They were enslaved white people too, I believe. So the derivation of the word slave encapsulates a bit of European history and explains why the words slaves and Slavs, esclav, are so similar. They are, in fact, historically identical. So Christian slavery and Barbary. So the Mamluks were slave soldiers who converted to Islam and served the Muslim caliphs. And the Ayyubid sultans during the Middle Ages. So the first Mamluks served the Abbasid caliphs in 9th century Baghdad. So Baghdad Muslims, Caliphate, New World Order under Islam, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish beasts. So over time, they became a powerful military caste, like today, ISIS and ISIL, Baal and Jezebel. And on more than one occasion, they seized power for themselves. For example, ruling Egypt from 1250 through 1517. The Muslims. That's why they're still there, and there's a lot of Arabs over there now. You don't see real Egyptians there, none of that stuff. Kabbalah, Allah, Rabbi, Abai, Rabbi, you see, which is all, Babel, all these people of Arab, Rabbi. So from 1250, Egypt had been ruled by the Bari dynasty of Kipchak, Turkish origin, Turkey, Muslims. So white enslaved people from the Caucasus served in the army and formed an elite corps of troops, eventually revolting in Egypt to form the Burgi dynasty. So white enslaved people from the Caucasus served in the army and formed an elite corps of troops, eventually revolting in Egypt to form the Burgi dynasty. So according to Robert Davis, between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were captured by Barbary pirates and sold as slaves to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire between the 16th and 19th century. So the coastal villages and towns of Italy and Rome, Portugal, Portuguese, Spain, land of the Spanish, and Mediterranean islands were frequently attacked by the pirates, and long stretches of the Italian and Spanish coasts were almost completely abandoned by their inhabitants because of the Muslims, like today. So after 1600, Barbary pirates occasionally entered the Atlantic and struck as far north as Iceland, probably where they get the word barbarian from. So the most famous corsairs were the Ottoman Barbarossa, Redbeard, Ottoman, Muslim, Edomite, Esau, Hittite, Hivite, Ishmaelite, Redbeard, Barbarossa, and his older brother Uruk Turgut Reis, known as Dragut in the west, Kurtoglu, known as Kurtogoli in the west, Kamal Rez, Salih Rez, and Koka Murat Rez, and you can tell the family by their last name. So in 1544, Hayreddin Barbarossa captured Ischia, taking 4,000 prisoners in the process, and deported to slavery some 9,000 inhabitants of Lipari, almost the entire population. In 1551, Dragut enslaved the entire population of the Maltese island Gozo, between 5,000 and 6,000, sending them to Libya. So when pirates sacked Vieste in southern Italy in 1554, they took an estimated 7,000 slaves. In 1555, Turgut Reis sailed to Corsica and ransacked Bastia, taking 6,000 prisoners. In 1558, Barbary corsairs captured the town of Ciutadella, destroyed it, slaughtered the inhabitants, and carried off 3,000 survivors to Istanbul, Turkey as slaves. Wow. So these people had part in that. This the king of the north, Turkey. So in 1563, Turgut Reis landed at the shores of the province of Granada, Spain, and captured the coastal settlements in the area like Almunacar, along with 4,000 prisoners. So Barbary pirates frequently attacked the Balearic Islands, resulting in many coastal watchtowers and fortified churches being erected. So the threat was so severe that Formentera became uninhabited. Early modern sources are full of descriptions of sufferings of Christian Galay slaves of the Barbary corsairs, which are probably under Muslims. So those who have not seen a galley at sea, especially in chasing or being chased, cannot well conceive the shock such a spectacle must give to a heart capable of the least tincture of commiseration. To behold ranks and files of half-naked, half-starved, half-tanned miagri wretches, chained to a plank, from whence they remove not for months together, commonly half a year, urged on even beyond human strength with cruel and repeated blows on their bare flesh. So as late as 1798, the Iset near Sardinia was attacked by the Tunisians, and over 900 inhabitants were taken away as slaves. So Sarari Moorish society in northwest Amexem, Africa, was traditionally and still is to some extent stratified into several tribal castes, with the Hassan warrior tribes ruling and extracting tribute horma from the subservient Berber descended Zinaga tribes. So below them rank servile groups known as Haratin, a black population. So Moorish Northwest African warriors. So Horn of Africa, slavery in Ethiopia. These are our families. So a Bantu slave woman in Mogadishu, 1882 to 1883. And we're not slaves. We are royal kings and royal priests and royal queens. So in the Horn of Africa, the Christian Solomonic dynasty of the Ethiopian highlands, although I don't believe in Christian Ethiopia, I believe in Hebrew Ethiopia, so often exported Nilotic slaves from their western borderland provinces, or from newly conquered or reconquered lowland territories. The Somali and Afar Muslim sultanates, such as the medieval Adal Sultanate, through their ports also traded Zanj, which is Bantu slaves that were captured from their hinterland. And I believe that Zanj also in Creole mean ange, like a angel. Zanj, ange, Bantu. So Somali and Afar Muslims or Muslim sultanates through their ports used to trade Bantu slaves, which mean Ethiopian or Zanj slaves, Bantu, the Arabs. So slaves in Ethiopia, 19th century. So slavery as practice in what is modern Ethiopia, in Eritrea, was essentially domestic. So slaves thus served in the houses of their masters or mistresses, and were not employed to any significant extent for productive purpose. They were like house slaves. So slaves were thus regarded as second-class members of their owner's family. So the first attempt to abolish slavery in Ethiopia was made by Emperor Tewodros II from 1855 to 68. Haiti got their independence in 1804. So although the slave trade was not abolished legally until 1923 with Ethiopia's accession to the League of Nations, which is the United Nations, Anti-Slavery Society estimated there were 2 million slaves in the early 1930s out of an estimated population of between 8 and 16 million. So slavery continued in Ethiopia until the Italian invasion in October 1935, when the institution was abolished by order of the Italian occupying forces. So in response to pressure by Western allies of World War II, Ethiopia officially abolished slavery and involuntary servitude after having regained its independence in 1942. So on the 26th day of August 1942, Haile Selassie issued a proclamation outlawing slavery. Were purchased in the slave market exclusively to do work on plantation grounds. They toiled under the control of and separately from their Somali patrons. So in terms of legal considerations, Bantu slaves were devalued, undervalued like today. Additionally, Somali social mores strongly discouraged, censored, and looked down upon any kind of sexual contact with Bantu slaves, with Hebrews. So they did not mix with us, some of them. So freedom for these plantation slaves were also often acquired through escape. So Central Africa, a slave market in Khartoum, 1876. So oral tradition recounts slavery existing in the Kingdom of Congo from the time of its formation with Lukeni Lua Nimi, enslaving the Mweni Kabanga, whom he conquered, to establish the kingdom. So early Portuguese writings show that the kingdom did have slavery before contact, but that they were primarily war captives from the kingdom of Ndongo, war captives from another tribe. And Portuguese were the ones who invaded Congo. So West Africa. So Homan here's map of the local slave trade in West Africa from Senegal and Cape Blanc to Guinea, the Kakango and Barbella rivers, and Ghana Lake on the Niger River as far as Regio Ori. There goes Togo. So we're going to continue on from where we at. So slavery was practiced in diverse ways in the different communities of West Africa prior to European trade. So with the development of the trans-Saharan slave trade and the economies of gold in the Western Sahel, a number of the major states became organized around the slave trade, including the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and Songhai Empire. So, however, other communities in West Africa largely resisted the slave trade. The Mosi kingdoms tried to take over key sites in the trans-Saharan trade. And when these efforts failed, the Mosi became defenders against slave raiding by the powerful states of the Western Sahel. So the Mosi would eventually enter the slave trade in the 1800s, with the Atlantic slave trade being the main market. So they were engaged in that, the Mosi kingdom. So similarly, Walter Rodney identified no slavery or significant domestic servitude in early European accounts on the upper Guinea region. And Akin Jogbin contends that European accounts reveal that the slave trade was not a major activity along the coast controlled by the Yoruba people and Aja people before European arrived. So it contends that European accounts reveal that the slave trade was not a major activity along the coast that was controlled by Yoruba and Aja people before Europeans arrived. It became major after they arrived. Then it became a market. They made it like they pretty much made it into what it should have been, what it is today. Slavery. So in a paper read to the Ethnological Society of London in 1866, the Viceroy of Lokoja, Mr. T. Valentine Robbins, who accompanied the expedition up to the River Niger aboard the HMS Investigator in 1864, described slavery in the region. So upon slavery, Mr. Robbins remarked that it was not what people in England thought it to be. So it means as continually found in this part of Africa, belonging to a family group, there is no compulsory labor. The owner and the slave work together, eat the like food, wear the like clothing, and sleep in the same huts. Some slaves have more wives than their masters. It gives protection to the slaves and everything necessary for their subsistence, food, and clothing, and shelter. So a free man is worse off than a slave. He cannot claim his food from anyone. Exactly. No forgiveness or redemption. So the government got paid for our stuff because they are our slave master. So with the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, demand for slavery in West Africa increased, and a number of states became centered on the slave trade, and domestic slavery increased drastically. So in Senegambia, between the 1300s and 1900s, close to 1/3 of the population was enslaved. So in early Islamic states of the Western Sudan, Islamic State, ISIS in Sudan, including Ghana, so Ghana is part of Muslim too or something, 750 to 1076, Mali, 1235 through 1645, Segu, 1712 to 1861, fighting Muslims, and Songhai, 1275 through 1591. All these places were prominently dominated by Islam. About 1/3 of the population were enslaved. So in Sierra Leone, in the 19th century, about half of the population consisted of enslaved people. In the 19th century. In the 19th century, at least half the population was enslaved among the Dula of the Cameroon and other peoples of the lower Niger, the Congo, and the Kasanje Kingdom, and Kokui and Angola. So these tribes were fighting each other at that time. There was division. So something caused us to unite in Ahiti and things like that to fight against this heathen, because we had a common threat like black people today. So among the Ashanti and Yoruba, 1/3 of the population consisted of enslaved people. And they could have been moved there during the Great Reconstruction, relocation. People being exiled from their groups, doing people ice cold. And erasing the tattoo off their face and the mask and the marks. So the population of the Kanem, 1600s to 1800s, was about 1/3 enslaved. Kanem. It was perhaps 40% in Bornu, 1580 to 1890. So between 1750 and 1900, from 1 to 2/3 of the entire population of the Fulani Jihad states consisted of enslaved people. So there was the Fulani tribe, which are Islamic Jihad Caliphate, and they were a beast that was slain, and now they're back as Iron Clay, which is the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, Turkey, Pergamus, the seed of Satan, the Grecians mixed with the African Saharan Muslims, Catholic and Muslim. So the population of Sokoto Caliphate, formed by Hassas in the northern Nigeria and Cameroon, was half enslaved in the 19th century by these Arabs, by the 19th century, and these are the people we ran from. So when British rule was first imposed on the Sokoto Caliphate and the surrounding areas in northern Nigeria, during the Medes and Persian age, when the Grecian brass was coming before Rome, and the surrounding areas in northern Nigeria at the turn of the 20th century, approximately 2 million to 2.5 million people were enslaved. Slavery in northern Nigeria was finally outlawed in 1936. So African Great Lakes. Zanzibari slave trader Tipu owned 10,000 slaves. This dark-skinned man right here, looking like one of us nearly. So they owned 10,000 slaves. And you know how they felt about Israel, Ethiopians. So with sea trade from the eastern African Great Lakes, so sea trade from the eastern African Great Lakes, or rivers in the East Africa, Yis-RoyAl. So to Persia, to Iran, China, and India during the first millennium AD, slaves are mentioned as a commodity, a product, security, asset of secondary importance to gold and ivory. That is the faith and credit of the United States. So when mentioned, the slave trade appears to be of a small scale and mostly involves slave raiding of women and children along the islands of Kilwa, Kisiwani, Madagascar, and Pemba. These people, like Lemba, were Israelites. Definitely Israelite. So historians Campbell and Alpers argue that there was a host of different categories of labor in Southeast Africa, and that the distinction between slave and free individuals were not particularly relevant in most societies. So, however, with increasing international trade in the 18th and 19th century, Southeast Africa began to be involved significantly in the Atlantic slave trade. Significantly, Southeast Africa. For example, with the king of Kilwa Island signing a treaty with the French merchant in 1776, when America had declared their independence and Illuminati was created, and Toussaint Louverture and Haitians were fighting in Haiti against the white man. So he signed a treaty with the French merchant in 1776 for the delivery of 1,000 slaves per year. So at about the same time, merchants from Oman, India, and Southeast Africa, from Oman, which is near, in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, India, and Southeast Africa, began establishing plantations along the coast and on the islands. So they began with the Saharan slave trade. So to provide workers on these plantations, slave raiding and slave holding became increasingly important in the region, and slave traders, most notably Tipu Tip, became prominent in the political environment of the region. So the Southeast African trade reached its height in the early decades of the 1800s, with up to 30,000 slaves sold per year. Wow. So, however, slavery never became a significant part of the domestic economies except in Sultanate of Zanzibar, where plantations and agricultural slavery were maintained, like the sultans. So author and historian Timothy Inso wrote, figures record the exporting of 718,000 slaves from the Swahili coast during the 19th century, and the retention of 769,000 on the coast. And these were Israelites, most. So in the Great Lakes region of Africa, around present-day Uganda, linguistic evidence shows the existence of slavery through war capture, trade, and pawning, just like they did with Rwanda, going back hundreds of years. However, these forms, particularly pawning, appear to have increased significantly in the 18th and 19th centuries. So transformations of slavery in Africa. So the door of no return in Wida, memorial to the slave trade through the port of Wida. So slave relationships in Africa. So slave relationships in Africa been transformed through three large-scale processes: the Arab slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and the Atlantis slave trade, and the emancipation policies and movements in the 19th and 20th century. So slave emancipation policies like black codes, code noirs, civil rights and all that junk, code noir, and movements in the 19th and 20th century. So each of these processes significantly changed the forms, level, and economics of slavery in Africa, so it upgraded and evolved. It's slick nowadays, subtle, like a beast, a silent killer, like gas. So, like carbon dioxide. So, slave practices in Africa were used during different periods to justify specific forms of European engagement with the peoples of Africa. So, it helped solidify the powers of the Europeans so the Africans can also have power too through the European. So 18th century writers in Europe claimed that slavery in Africa was quite brutal in order to justify the Atlantic slave trade. So later writers used similar arguments to justify intervention and eventual colonization by European powers to end slavery in Africa. So Africans knew of the harsh slavery that awaited slaves in the New World. Many elite Africans visited Europe on slave ships following the prevailing winds through the New World. So one example of this occurred when Antonio Manuel, Congo's ambassador to the Vatican, went to Europe in 1604, stopping first in Bahia, Brazil, where he arranged to free a countryman who had been wrongfully enslaved. So African monarchs also sent their children along these same slave routes to be educated in Europe. And thousands of former slaves eventually returned to settle Liberia and Sierra Leone. So trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade. So 19th century engraving of Arab slave trading, carving, transporting African slaves from the Sahara or across the Sahara, probably into Spain, into Europe and things like that. So the Moors are sellout group, the ones with the red fez. So the Arab slave trade, established in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, involved a small scale movement of people largely from the eastern Great Lakes region in the Sahel. So Islamic law allowed slavery but prohibited slavery involving other pre-existing Muslims. So even Muslims don't enslave Muslims. See, that's sad, but blacks kill blacks, whites don't even kill whites. See a pattern here? So as a result, the main target for slavery were the people who lived in the frontier areas of Islam in Africa. So the trade of slaves across the Sahara and across the Indian Ocean also has a long history, beginning with the control of sea routes by Afro-Arab traders in the 9th century. African Arabs. So it is estimated that only a few thousand enslaved people were taken each year from the Red Sea near Mecca and Indian Ocean coasts. So Ethiopia and things like that. Lemba, Bantu and things like that. So they were sold throughout the Middle East into the Arabian areas, Arabian world, Assyrian Federation. So this trade accelerated as superior ships led to more trade and greater demand for labor on plantations in the region. So eventually tens of thousands per year were being taken. On the Swahili coast, the Afro-Arab slavers captured Bantu peoples. So Arabs and Israelites will never get along. From the interior and brought them to the littoral. This is all in scripture. So there the slaves gradually assimilated in the rural areas, particularly on the Unguja and Pemba Islands. We're literally scattered all across the world, y'all. Y'all see what I'm saying by needing to get a blood test? It makes sense. Let's read that bare record on earth. So this changed the slave relationships by creating new forms of employment by slaves as eunuchs to guard harems and in military units, like they did with Daniel. And creating conditions for freedom, namely conversion, although it would only free a slave's children. So although the level of the trade remained small, the size of total slaves traded grew to a large number of the multiple centuries of its existence. So because of its small and gradual nature, the impact on the slavery practices in communities that did not convert to Islam was relatively small. Now it's on a massive level, macro. And the Romans are helping the Islamic people do this, as well as the Muslim people helping the Catholic, like Obama and the Pope. So however, in the 1800s, the slave trade from Africa to the Islamic countries picked up significantly. So Israelites took it into Islamic countries, picked up significantly. When the European slave trade ended around the 1850s, the slave trade to the east picked up significantly, only to be ended with European colonization of Africa around 1900, probably by the aggressions of the Romans. That's the only way to know. So in 1814, Swiss explorer Johann Burckhardt wrote of his travels in Egypt and Nubia, where I wouldn't be surprised if they're children of Joseph, where he saw the practice of slave trading. So I frequently witnessed scenes of the most shameless indecency, which the traders, who were the principal actors, only laughed at. I may venture to state that very few female slaves who have passed their 10th year reach Egypt or Arabia in a state of virginity. So they were raping the women too, Arab, Egyptian, and all that. That's why a lot of people think they're Muslim, but they're not. So David Livingstone wrote of the slave trade. To overdraw its evils is a simple impossibility. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body and lying on the path. Onlookers, said an Arab, who passed early that morning, had done it in anger at losing the price he had given for her, because she was unable to walk any longer after the rape. We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead. We came upon a man dead from starvation. No wonder they have their women all veiled up. It's like a gay sodomy type of thing. They don't even know. But they're trying to act like they're keeping the laws of Abraham or the God of Abraham or Moses, and it's a lie. So the strangest disease I have seen in this country seems really to be broken-heartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves. Livingstone estimated that 80,000 Africans died each year before ever reaching the slave markets of Zanzibar, especially because of rape and all that other stuff, and the conditions and food and water shortages and famines and things like that, and deaths and suicides and diseases. So Zanzibar was once East Africa's main slave trading port. And under Omani Arabs in the 19th century, as many as 50,000 slaves were passing through the city each year. Wow. So I gotta do some research on that place. Key places to research to find our route. So Atlantic slave trade. African slaves working in 17th century Virginia by an unknown artist of 1670. So yeah, we're in Virginia as well. So the Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade took place across the Atlantic Ocean from the 15th through the 19th centuries. So the Atlantic slave trade was significant in transforming Africans from a small percentage of the global population of slaves in 1600 into the overwhelming majority by 1800. And we gained our independence 1804. So the slave trade was transformed from a marginal aspect of the economies into the largest sector in a relatively short span of time. So in addition, agricultural plantation, like the agricultural department in the US, dealing with patents and stuff like that, land and body and soil, and the vital statistic records. So agricultural plantations increased significantly and became a key aspect in many societies. Finally, it transformed the traditional distribution of the slave practices. So the first Europeans to arrive on the coast of Guinea were the Portuguese. The first European to actually buy enslaved Africans in the region of Guinea was Taino Goncalves, a Portuguese explorer in 1441. That was the first European to buy enslaved Africans in the region of Guinea. So originally, our people is probably in Portuguese as well. So originally interested in trading mainly for gold and spices. They set up colonies on the uninhabited islands of Sao Tome, the Portuguese. In the 16th century, the Portuguese settlers found that these volcanic areas were ideal for growing sugar. Volcanic islands. So sugar growing is a labor-intensive undertaking, and Portuguese settlers were difficult to attract due to the heat, lack of infrastructure, and hard life. To cultivate the sugar, the Portuguese turned to large numbers of enslaved Africans to cultivate the sugar. Elmina Castle on the Gold Coast of Ghana, originally built by African labor for the Portuguese in 1482 to control the gold trade, became an important depot for slaves that were to be transported to the New World Order. So slave trade along the Senegal River, Kingdom of Cayor. So the Spanish were the first Europeans to use enslaved Africans in the New World on islands such as Cuba and Hispaniola, where the alarming death rate in the native population had spurred the first royal laws protecting the native population, laws of Burgos, 1512 to 13. So the first enslaved Africans arrived in Hispaniola in Haiti in 1501, soon as the Papal Bull of 1493 gave almost all of the New World to Spain, like little Spaniard. So the first enslaved Africans arrived in Hispaniola in Haiti. So the Atlantic slave trade peaked in the late 18th century when the largest number of slaves were captured on raiding expeditions in the interior of West Africa. So the increase of demand for slaves due to the expansion of European colonial powers to the New World for the New World Order vision made the slave trade much more lucrative to the West African powers, leading to the establishment of a number of West African empires thriving on slave trade, like the Moors. So these included the Oyo Empire, Yoruba, Kong Empire, Kingdom of Benin, Imamate of Futa, Jalon, Imamate of Futa Toro, Kingdom of Koya, Kingdom of Kaso, Kingdom of Kaabu, Fante Confederacy, Ashanti Confederacy, and the Kingdom of Dahomey. So the gradual abolition of slavery in European colonial empires during the 19th century, so the white people were working with these black people side by side, again led to the decline and collapse of these African empires. So these kingdoms relied on a militaristic culture of constant warfare to generate the great numbers of human captives required for trade with the Europeans, and then hold them as slaves or prisoners of war and sold them. A scathing reminder of this incredible practice is documented in the slave trade debates of England in the early 19th century. So all the old writers concur in stating not only that wars are entered into for the sole purpose of making slaves, but that they are fomented by Europeans like today, with a view to that objective slavery, involuntary servitude. So when European powers began to stop the Atlantic slave trade, This caused a further change in the large holders of slaves in Africa began to exploit enslaved people on plantations and other agricultural products. So abolition. So the final major transformation of slave relationships came with the inconsistent emancipation efforts starting in the mid-19th century. So as European authorities began to take over large parts of inland Africa starting in the 1800s, the colonial policies were often confusing on the issue. For example, even when slavery was deemed illegal, colonial authorities would return escaped slaves to their masters. Slavery persisted in some countries under colonial rule, and in some instances it was not until the independence that slavery practices were significantly transformed, especially beginning in Haiti, causing France to draw out of the country and sell his interests in Louisiana to the United States. So anti-colonial struggles in Africa often brought slaves and former slaves together with masters and former masters to fight for independence. So masters and former masters were helping us too, anti-colonial struggles. However, this cooperation was short-lived, and following independence, political parties would often form based upon the stratifications of slaves and masters. So in some parts of Africa, slavery and slavery-like practices continue to this day, and the problem has proven to be difficult for governments and civil societies to eliminate, especially as they're promoting it. So slave memorial in Zanzibar, this picture right here, thrown into the hole. So efforts by Europeans against slavery and the slave trade began in the late 18th century and had a large impact on slavery in Africa. Europeans against slavery. They don't tell you much about that. So Portugal was the first country in the continent to abolish slavery by a bill issued on the 12th of February 1761. In metropolitan Portugal and Portuguese India, but not in the colonies of Brazil and Africa, where the Portuguese came in, Brazil and India. So France abolished slavery in 1794. However, slavery was again allowed by Napoleon in 1802 and not abolished for good until 1848. So in 1803, Denmark-Norway became the first country from Europe to implement a ban on the slave trade. So slavery itself was not banned until 1848. So Britain followed in 1807. They didn't really free us by 1848. It got worse and it evolved. It is a blackout like between New Testament and Old Testament, after Malachi and before Matthew. So with the passage of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act by Parliament, so this law allowed stiff fines, increasing with the number of slaves transported or kidnapped or arrested or incarcerated, for captains of slave ships, like judges, captain of the ship, the vessel, after you pass the Bridget bars, the bar of the demon. So Britain followed this with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which freed all slaves in the British Empire. So British pressure on other countries resulted in them agreeing to end the slave trade from Africa. They got another plan up their sleeve. Get them through religion. Have them worship our gods and things like that, so they never do rise against us again or get into that spirit of justice. So British pressure on other countries resulted in them agreeing to end the slave trade from Africa. So for example, the 1820 United States law on slave trade, made slave trading piracy, like pirates hijacking a ship or a vessel or a body, punishable by death, like treason and the wages of sin. So in addition, the Ottoman Empire abolished slave trade from Africa in 1847 under British pressure. So by 1850, the year that the last major Atlantic slave trade participant, Brazil, passed the Eusebio de Queiroz law, banning the slave trade. So the slave trades had been significantly slowed, and in generally only illegal trade. Brazil continued the practice of slavery and was a major source for illegal trade until about 1870, and the abolition of slavery became permanent in 1888. So when Princess Isabel of Brazil and Minister Rodrigo Silva, son-in-law of Senator Eusebio de Queiroz, banned the practice, so the British took an active approach to stopping the illegal Atlantic slave trade during this period. By the way, British is Barit Ish, that means man of covenant. So the West Africa Squadron was credited with capturing 1,600 slave ships between 1808 and 1860 and freeing 150,000 Africans who were aboard these ships, like in Africa. So action was also taken against African leaders who refused to agree to British treaties to outlaw the trade, because some African leaders were still trying to do this stuff. So it caused sanctions and stuff like that, and the nations united. For example, against the usurping king of Lagos, deposed in 1851. So anti-slavery treaties were signed with over 50 African rulers, Hamites, because the Hamites were part of enslaving us indeed, or the Israelites. So capture of slave ships. So although slavery within Africa had been of a limited nature, even during the peak of the Arab and Atlantic slave trades, this changed in the last half of the 19th century. So we can skip around a little bit. Let me see. So we don't really need these right here. Oh well, let's read it. This is important. So this change in the last half of the 19th century, Patrick Manning explains that if there is any time when one can speak of African societies being organized around the slave mode production, 1850 to 1900 was it. So the continuing anti-slavery movement in Europe became an excuse and a casus belli for the European conquest and colonization of much of African continent as peacekeepers. That's the Gis. We gotta arrest the bandits, the bad guys. That's when America took on the identity of being the world's savior. Hey, let's go save this nation and that nation out of what they never asked to be saved out of. So it was the central theme of the Brussels Anti-Slavery Conference, 1889 to 90. So in the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa saw the continent rapidly divided between imperialistic European powers. So the continent rapidly was divided between imperialistic European powers, like martial law, emperors, dictators, chief executive officer, trustee. and an early but secondary focus of all colonial regimes was the suppression of slavery and the slave trade. So that's part of their plan, pretending they're stopping slave trade but engaging it some other how, especially with prisoners. So in response to this pressure, Ethiopia officially abolished slavery in 1933. Sokoto Caliphate abolished in 1900. And the rest of the Sahel in 1911. So by the end of the colonial period, they were mostly successful in this aim, though slavery is still very active in Africa, even though it has gradually moved to a wage economy. Credit and debit. Independent nations attempting to westernize or impress Europe sometimes cultivated an image of slavery suppression, even as they, in the case of Egypt, hired European soldiers like Samuel White Baker's expedition up the Nile. So slavery has never been eradicated in Africa, and it commonly appears in African states such as Chad, Ethiopia, Mali, Niger, and Sudan, and places where law and order have collapsed. So although outlawed in nearly all countries today, slavery is practiced in secret in many parts of the world. There are an estimated 30 million victims of slavery worldwide. So in Mauritania alone, up to 600,000 men, women, and children, or 20% of the entire population, are enslaved. Many of them used as bonded labor. So slavery in Mauritania was finally criminalized in August 2007. Dang, that's recent. During the Second Sudanese Civil War, people were taken into slavery. Estimates of abductions range from 14,000 to 200,000. In Niger, where the practice of slavery was outlawed in 2003, a study found that almost 8% of the population are still slaves in those locations and places, especially in Asia. Alright, I don't think we really need this right here, but let's see. So to meet the demand for menial labor, Zanj slaves, which are Bantu, captured from the southern interior, were sold through ports on the northern seaboard in cumulatively large numbers over the centuries to customers, investors in the Nile Valley, Horn of Africa, Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, India, Far East, and the Indian Ocean islands. So I don't think we really need much of this. So the borders of Japheth was definitely being enlarged because Europe and Asia grew dramatically, while we just kept dying and things like that. So they said they used to trade these shells. Shells were used as money in the slave trade because that was valuable. That was the medium of exchange. So two slightly differing Okpoho manillas as used to purchase slaves, to enslave us to forever. And this was all commercial slave trade. So there is a long-standing debate about analysis and scholars about the destructive impacts of the slave trades. It is often claimed that the slave trade undermined local economies and political stability as villages' vital labor forces were shipped overseas as slave raids and civil wars became commonplace. So with the rise of a large commercial slave trade, driven by European needs and desires and lusts, temptations, passion, desire, and fire, enslaving your enemy became less a consequence of war and more a reason to go to war. Like today. So the slave trade is claimed impeded the formation of larger ethnic groups, causing ethnic factionalism and weakening the formation for stable political structures in many places. They damage us badly. We can't stand on our feet. So it also is claimed to have reduced the mental health and social development of African people. So we've been damaged. So in contrast to these arguments, let me see, I don't think we really need that. So in contrast to these arguments, J.D. Fage asserts that slavery did not have a wholly disastrous effect on the societies of Africa. Slaves were an expensive commodity, and traders received, so we were a commodity, the faith and credit, a medium of exchange, a security asset, deposited in the Treasury's bank. So slaves were an expensive commodity, and traders received a great deal in exchange for each enslaved person. So at the peak of the slave trade, hundreds of thousands of muskets, vast quantities of cloth, gunpowder, and metals were being shipped to Guinea. Most of this money was spent on British-made firearms of very poor quality. So they were buying guns, but not the best kinds, and industrial-grade alcohol, like you see in today's liquor stores today. And those firearms, they sell them to Islam today too, or give it to them in packages. Airplane missions, CIA operation, Black Ops. So Majestic 12. So trade with Europe, the Knights of Malta too. So trade with Europe at the peak of the slave trade, which also included significant exports of gold and ivory. And you know the Moors were dealing with the Europeans. Was some 3.5 million pounds sterling per year. Wow. So by contrast, so we used to go by weight. So contrast, the trade of the United Kingdom, the economic superpower of the time, was about 14 million pounds per year over this same period of the late 18th century. So Patrick Manning has pointed out the vast majority of items traded for slaves were common rather than luxury goods. So textiles, iron ore, currency, notes, bonds, money orders, checks, negotiable instruments, bills of exchange, and salt were some of the most important commodities imported as a result of the slave trade, and these goods were spread within the entire society, raising the general standard of living. So, effects on Europe's economy. So Karl Marx, in his economic history of capitalism, Das Kapital, claimed that the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, that is the slave trade, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production and monopoly by families that had owned slaves. So we argue that the slave trade, like the Vatican and Pope and the Queen are still, and Prince, all that, are still benefiting off of our hard work and toil today. We got them good. They became so rich off of the slave trade that they've been good for a few years. They've been living off of stolen fruit. So we argue that the slave trade was part of what he termed the primitive accumulation of European capital. It's probably where they get the word capital from. The non-capitalist accumulation of wealth that preceded and created the financial conditions for Britain's industrialization today. So we built the Vatican and the mosque and the temples and all that stuff. So Eric Williams has written about the contribution of Africans on the basis of profits from the slave trade and slavery, arguing that the employment of those profits were used to help finance Britain's industrialization, the Boer Empire. So he argues that the enslavement of Africans was an essential element to the Industrial Revolution. And I learned a piece of that in business class. So in that European wealth was in part a result of slavery, of blood, sweat, and tears. But that by the time of its abolition it had lost its profitability and it was in Britain's economic interest to ban it. So Joseph Inekori has written that the British slave trade was more profitable than the critics of Williams believe. So other researchers and historians have strongly contested that has come to be referred to as the Williams thesis in academia. David Rickardson has concluded that the profits from the slave trade amounted to less than 1% of domestic investment in Britain. And economic historian Stanley Engerman finds that even without subtracting the associated costs of the slave trade, expenses like shipping costs, slave mortality, mortality of whites in Africa, defense costs, or reinvestment of profits, or rehypothecation of leverage, back into the slave trade, like the bond market, financial language, currency language of the sea, admiralty, adjacent to the sea. So the total profits, so pirates, shipmen, navy men, and marine. So the total profits from the slave trade and of West Indian plantations, which is Jamaica, Cuba, Brazil, Haiti, things like that, amounted to less than 5% of the British economy during any year of the Industrial Revolution. So I don't really care about this part, so I'm going to kind of skip through this. So it's saying that it was a small share of national income. That's crazy. So alright, so let's continue on. So these people were arguing about this dumb stuff. Before the Industrial Revolution and Napoleonic Wars with Haiti, they don't want to say. So the legacy of racism now, to kill people who try to rebuild themselves and build and destroy courage and stuff like that, and those trying to wake up. So legacy of racism. So Malana Korenga states that the effects of the Atlantic slave trade in African captives was the morally monstrous destruction of human possibility, involved redefining African humanity to the world, poisoning past, present, and future relations with others who only know us through this stereotyping, and thus damaging the truly human relations among people of today. So he cites that it constituted the destruction of culture, language, religion, and human possibility. And the earth is wailing and crying because it have not forsook us. So that was all that was taking place during that time. Let me see where we are on time. Alright, let's continue on. So now we're gonna go into a little bit more. We're gonna get into some other stuff too, especially deep about Islam, but not yet. I want to make sure we do this first. So I don't think there's much to read from this. So we'll skip around places. So it may take a little bit more videos than I thought it would. But let's exit out of that. Yes. Let me put this right here. Halaluyahnu. Yahuaruak. Zaboat. Zabaut. They look like they be raping that little girl. And they dressed her up in their clothing almost. It's probably where you get these Moors trying to act like they're Arab from. Look at them. They look like they mixed with white and African. Or actually Shemite mixed with Japhet. Alright. So let's see, we gotta get this from here. So Slavery in America by Ronald L. F. Davis. So songs we would never hear, histories we would never know, art we would never see, because the European had the capacity to destroy and didn't have the moral restraint not to. Malana Korenga. Wow. Well, pardon me, let me do that first and then this. So on the eve of the American Civil War, approximately 4 million enslaved African Americans lived in southern region of the United States of America. So the vast majority worked as plantation slaves in the production of cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rice. And we heard about other ones too. You should see how they make them iPhones by slavery. And they had it sold in the stock market like the Most High said we would. So Ma'afa. So who are these people? How did they live? What will happen if they are freed? Will they go to the north or to the west? Or will they stay in the south? The so-called contrabands, enslaved African Americans within Union lines prior to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 were more than a curiosity. So, however, they also posed a real problem to whites in general and the Union Army in particular as to what to do with them. Up to this point in the war, the Union had not fully committed its forces to the idea of civil war as a war to end slavery, rather than a limited war to preserve the Union. So slaves, on the other hand, forced the issue by seeking out the Union forces in droves, looking for protection and offering their services to the army that would one day free them permanently. James F. Gibson, Library of Congress. Political map. So this is a political map, and this may not be a true map of the United States, to be honest. Like the sky and earth is flat. Yes, I said it. So creating slavery. So slavery in the United States was part of a long established system of labor exploitation. Working for no pay, service, labor, that dates to ancient times. So much of the ancient world was composed of well-organized slave societies of one sort or another. Slavery existed in the great civilizations of ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, China, and even among the Inca and Aztec worlds of pre-colonial America, but because it was Hebrews fighting these children of the devil, Cain, enmity between the children of Adam and Eve and Satan. So the womb is a portal. Believe that. So the business of capturing and trading enslaved people, it was a business of capturing and trading and hunting down dark-skinned people, was also a fundamental part of human society. We have built society through our work. So prior to the Atlantic trade of enslaved Africans to the Americas, Muslim traders out of the Middle East and Northern Africa purchased, sold, and captured millions of enslaved Africans and Central Europeans in a slave trading network that extended from present-day Hungary to southeastern Asia and the Far East. So captives below deck. The artist Evans has 4 scenes in this image, all displaying very different aspects of slave life and the hull of a ship during their captive passage. So during their captive passage. Oh yeah, I already took it down. So one can only try to imagine the mental state of these people who were torn from their homeland and kin. Exactly. Herded like cattle by strangers to an unknown destination and uncertain future. Like the Bible said, your future will hang in doubt. So in 1704, James Island, a slave trader, complained about his impossible task of fitting the large number of slaves on board the postilion, stating that the slaves are so large, and the general opinion being that the slaves could not be healthy in the space of 3 foot. So where do you think the shipmate is taking the group of slaves in the upper left image? Notice how the ribs of the children showed through their skin. What do you think they are looking at? So let's check that out real quick. Like that right there. So notice the expression on the mother's face as she holds her baby in bottom image. What things might she be thinking at that moment? So that's by that person. So let me see. Yeah, this is gonna take a little longer than I thought it would, so be patient with me. You can contact me at godlivesinOurHeart at hotmail.com. God lives in our heart at hotmail.com if you're interested in getting in contact with me. Or you can reach me on Skype. It's a messenger. You can get it off Yahoo or Google search, and go ahead and add me under the screen name Archangel Macintosh, MAKINTOSH, Archangel Macintosh, and we can commune from there and break bread and share information and knowledge. And remember to like this video if you guys are enjoying the series or whatever, or if you believe in the information. So let's go and scroll down. Until the lions tell their tale, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Alright. Trying to look for that picture they were talking about. I don't see no picture. I'm gonna just leave it. So there was nothing especially new about slavery as a system of labor. So labor union work is modern day slavery. And the exploitation of people overtime and all that stuff. When the Spanish and the Portuguese first began bringing slaves in 1503 from Western Africa to replace Native Americans in the gold mines of the Carib in Central America, Arawak, like Central America and things like that. So the extent and impact, however, of the vast numbers of enslaved Africans thereafter brought to the New World to work the sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton plantations was simply phenomenal. Just unrecordable to a degree, unexplainable. Like, what the hell was in them white people in the Arabs' mind? So this transatlantic trade created a new global economy and an international world. So this new Atlantic world, Atlantis, was unlike anything ever known before, linking the Americas to Africa and Europe in ways that resulted in the development of Europe and North America and the undevelopment of Africa and the rest of the Americas. So it is not too much to say that profits made from slavery and the slave trade in the years from 1600 to 1860 greatly contributed to the emergence of Western Europe and the United States as the dominant nations of the world. America and Europe, the superpower, and Mecca. So let's continue down. So this image of a sugar plantation and mill looks benign compared to the reality of the industry. So by the mid-1700s, as much as 200,000 tons of sugar was exported annually from the Americas. This in turn created a high demand for African slave labor in English and Dutch Caribbean colonies to grow the sugar cane and work the mills. So the work was grueling and dangerous. Cutting cane with sharp knives, grinding and pressing the canes, and tending fires around the clock for boiling the cane into a sweet juice that eventually evaporated into sugar crystals was perhaps the most arduous work of all the agricultural tasks performed by the enslaved in the Americas. Israelites. So sugar was far more difficult work than cultivating cotton, tobacco, or rice. So many slaves died within a few years of their arrival in the sugar islands, sometimes only months, that a steady fresh supply was always needed. Mariner's Museum. So slavery in North America differed significantly from slavery in the rest of the Americas. In the first place, far fewer slaves were brought into what became the United States. Only around 500,000 compared, 500,000 compared to perhaps 12 to 13 million imported into the Caribbean, like Haiti, South and Central America. That's where we at. So most of these imports to North America ended by 1770. Moreover, except for a burst of activity by a few southern states after the American Revolution. So secondly, the fact that the English people had little experience with slavery in comparison to the Spanish and Portuguese meant that little historical reference existed for them to draw upon in the early years. So initially, the first slaves in the Virginia colony were looked upon as workers rather than as property, and some of them were treated much like white indentured servants, like old-time slavery. So the enslaved Africans often worked alongside the indentured European laborers in the tobacco fields of the Chesapeake, Chesapeake region. Chesapeake region. So the enslaved Africans often worked alongside the indentured European laborers in the tobacco fields of the Chesapeake region. Nor were the Africans especially valued. It was cheaper in the earlier years, like Mexicans, to bring in white laborers from England as indentured servants than to pay for slaves. And most whites looked upon Africans as morally and intellectually inferior in any case, like you see today. They give you that eye. That's what we call it now, the eye. Y'all white people know what I'm talking about. So for complex reasons, the value and presence of enslaved workers from Africa began to grow after 1676 in Virginia colony. So for one thing, white indentured servants could easily run away. They also demanded to be treated like Englishmen, especially in terms of their rations of gorg and time off from labor, like English people, like white people. Let's get time off and stuff like that. A raise or something, you know. So importantly too, the supply of white indentured servants began to decline as more working class whites found employment back home in British industries. So whites found employment back home, and they're not from Europe anyway. So commerce and shipping, like you see today. So in the increase in the lifespan of indentured servants in the New World meant that many of them began to live long enough to claim the share of lands promised to those who had labored the full terms of their indenture, usually 6 years, like a jubilee, and the 40 acres and a mule thing, which was a form of reparation during that time. So enslaved Africans, on the other hand, could not easily blend into the surrounding white population, nor was Jesus or Yahusha able to do that among the Egyptians and Moses among the Egyptians. By escaping, so it was not easily, they could not easily blend into the surrounding white population by escaping. And Native Americans were often employed as slave catchers. Some of them Taino, Arawak, and Caribs were often employed as slave catchers. So nor could they make demands upon their masters for humane treatment, justice, or land. Like today, they call it Code Noir. And the Dred Scott rule. So in inspection and sale of a captive, an American man is being inspected for sale to European or American slavers, while a white man talks with African slave traders. So these are Asians, look at them. They're not us, they're Asians. Asian African, Asiatic, Afro-Asian, Asiatic. So the Arabs were the earliest non-Africans to buy African slaves. So Arabs don't consider themselves African. A lot of people hate the African roots. So in the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain began to send African-born slaves to their colonies in the New World, Hispaniola, America, and things like that. And in the following century, England, France, and the Netherlands entered the trade, as eventually did the United States. So rum and guns were among the items most frequently traded for slaves. Little basic things. So perhaps most importantly, in the opinion of some historians, upper-class whites began to fear an alliance between indentured servants and enslaved Africans after Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in 1676. of 1676. So this rebellion against the planter gentry by unruly, lower-class whites in the inferior of the colony, like hillbillies, or white trash, that's what they called them, convinced upper-class whites in the coastal regions to replace indentured laborers with the more easily disciplined and less expensive slaves. That's when they started to replace them. So it mattered too that Virginia passed laws defining slaves as cattle property whose status was both lifelong and hereditary, saying that we're slaves for life. So after 1680, Virginia planters began buying large numbers of Africans, the farmers, your revolutionaries, your American forefathers. They're, the founding fathers, which is a lie. So to the south of the Virginia colony, slavery took on a different look. In the coastal plain or low country regions of Georgia and Carolina, the cultivation of rice on large plantations more closely resembled the practice of slavery in the West Indies. So most of the first English settlers in this region had migrated from the Barbados to the area around Charleston beginning in 1670. So the first English settlers in this region had migrated from the Barbados to the area around Charleston beginning in 1670. So they were already there too, Barbados. So bringing slaves with them from Barbados. The rice planters never employed indentured servants, never, but imported large cargoes of slaves directly from Africa, and most of them were African males. So, in this region, nearly 90% of the population was African American. 90% Israelite. So by the 1750s, the cultivation of rice and slavery spread westward into Georgia, which was established in 1732 as a refuge for England's poor, including male convicts and impoverished women and children. So at first the colony banned slavery, but the lure of profits found white planters ignoring the ban, and by 1776 the colony had more African Americans living there than whites, approximately 15,000. So we everywhere, we're Israelites. So continuing on. So Reverend John Rankin and wife, 1793 to 1886, pictured here with his wife on their 50th wedding anniversary. The life of John Rankin represents a deep belief in the right to freedom for all people regardless of race. So as a Presbyterian minister, Presbyterian minister, Rankin started an anti-slavery society in Carlisle, Kentucky. Amidst angry slave owners, he eventually moved to Ripley, Ohio, where slavery was illegal, although many whites in Bohio, where slavery was illegal, although many whites in the area remained strong pro-slavery supporters. So in risk working as a conductor and station keeper on the Underground Railroad, Rankin lectured across the northern states for the American Anti-Slavery Society, often falling victim to mob violence, you nigger lover and stuff like that. So one time pro-slavery advocates shaved his horse's tail and mane in an effort to embarrass and scare him. In 1829, Rankin established the historic Ripley College, Ripley's Believe It or Not, enrolling the first African American student in 1831. So do you think it was dangerous to hide slaves in your home? Oh yeah. How do you think slave owners felt about Rankin's work? How do you think his family felt about sharing their home and food with these strangers? Ohio Historical Society. So at the time of the American Revolution, slavery was a profitable but not all-pervasive institution in the British colonies of North America. So North America is part of Britain. So most prosperous in the low country areas. It was beginning to reach a point of diminishing returns in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. Land of Mary. So the 100 years of tobacco cultivation has exalted much of the land in the Chesapeake area. Also, there seemed to be little likelihood that tobacco and rice could be as easily cultivated in the lands west of the coastal colonies. So the place, location, environment, it all controls production of goods. So during the great constitutional debates in the late 1780s over what the new nation would look like in the future, so that's what they were trying to create with that constitution, black codes. It was commonly assumed that slavery would gradually end soon in the next century. So white Southerners nevertheless managed to win from the North 3 significant concessions protecting the institution of slavery. So the white Southerners did that. So 1. The Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which enabled slave catchers to cross state lines in the pursuit of runaway slaves, which the Bible said you couldn't do. So 2. The 3/5 clause agreement, quorum, to count every slave as 3/5 of a free person in determining a state's representation in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. And 3. The continuation of the slave trade with Africa until 1808, which brought thousands of slaves to America in a rush of slave trading activity, human trafficking. That's where that word gets its history. So still, all the signs suggested that slavery was a terminal institution in the nation at the time of the ratification of the United States Constitution in 1789. So a number of northern states had abolished slavery by the 1800s. And the federal Congress banned slavery from the vast region of unorganized territory north of the Ohio or Bohio River with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So dozens of anti-slavery societies spring up in the northern states and the upper south, and many enslaved African Americans openly challenged the system by suing for their freedom in state courts and by running away. Nevertheless, the ending of slavery did not happen for another 60 years. In fact, it took on a new life in the new century, spreading rapidly from Georgia to Texas by 1830. Reminds me of New York, New England, New Zealand, New Jersey. So although the South had gained, North and South Carolina was probably fighting too, North-South. So although the South had gained a major political advantage with the 3/5 clause, enabling it to dominate the Electoral College in the United States Congress for much of the next 50 years. So the rebirth of slavery in the next century was due principally to other factors. As an aside, had slaves not been counted as a basis for representation, John Adams would have been elected president over the slaveholder Thomas Jefferson in 1800. And most likely the strong abolitionist John Quincy Adams would have defeated the southern slaveholder Andrew Jackson in 1828. And these were the ones who fought for the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and stuff like that. So most important in the resurgence of slavery and its spread westward from the increased cultivation of cotton due to the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. So this relatively simple machine invented by Eli Whitney removed seeds and trash from the short staple cotton easily grown in much of the South. So prior to the invention of the cotton gin, short staple cotton had to be combed by hand before it could be spun into thread, a costly labor-intensive process. At the same time, England turned from wool to cotton for its textiles and began consuming with a ravenous appetite American cotton. So the surge of cotton production from the U.S. jumped from 3,000 bales in 1890 to nearly 200,000 bales by 1812. That's how cotton was important in America. So it stood at 4,449,000 bales in 1860, which each bale weighing between 30 to 60 pounds. Wow, of cotton. On the eve of the Civil War, the value of cotton exports amounted to over 50% of the value of all United States exports. So picking cotton. Here the artist shows two men and one woman picking cotton. So each worker puts the picked cotton into a long bag, which they drag behind them in the fields. So typically each worker carried two bags into the fields, made of coarse cotton with straps and a large willow basket, not shown in the painting. So the bags were suspended from their shoulders or waists. When one bag was full, the worker filled up the second bag and then carried both to the basket. By the end of the day, the large basket would be taken to a waiting wagon. A worker's total pick would be carefully weighed on a field scale before the cotton was packed into the wagon. So we can skip these parts right here. So they introduce us to cotton and things like that. So they always harvested the cotton, moreover, in the heat of late summer, commonly under a blazing sun. Wow. So it was back-breaking work. So a normal field hand was expected to be able to pick 100 to 50 to 200 pounds of cotton per day. No wonder we strong. So some enslaved workers were known to pick as much as 500 pounds daily. It was back-breaking work, from can to can't, or from when you first could see the sun in the morning until it was dark. So they always harvest the cotton, moreover in the heat of late summer, commonly under a blazing sun, So they had to work fast to make their quota, and they had to work carefully, like when Pharaoh said build brick out of straw, so as not to introduce too much dirt or trash into the bags. So women and children were often valued as pickers because of their ability to pick clean cotton, meaning cotton free of stems or trash. And because they did not have to stoop quite so low as men, they suffered less back pain. So our people had back pain during that time. So notice the cabins in the background, typical of slave houses throughout the South. So each cabin probably housed 2 or 3 families. Other points of interest in this painting are the picked stubbles in the field, the clouded sky, and the clothes worn by the cotton pickers. What do you think the artist is trying to convey by these details? Let's see if we can get a picture. So this dramatic increase in cotton production was accompanied by a massive increase in the slave population. So that caused a need and high demand for more slaves, more workers. It rose from 697,897 in 1790 to nearly 4 million in 1860. Growing fastest in the cotton producing states of Alabama, cotton picking states, Mississippi, Arkansas. So both Mississippi and South Carolina had more slave than free inhabitants by 1860. Most southern whites did not own slaves, only about 400,000 out of 9 million in 1860. So of those who did own slaves, half owned fewer than 5 slaves in 1560. So very few slaveholders owned 20 or more slaves. Usually 20 slaves define one as a planter, one about 12%, only about 12%. So very few slaveholders owned 20 or more slaves, only about 12%. And only 1% of the slaveholders owned more than 50 slaves. On the other hand, 56% of all slaves lived and worked on plantations of more than 20 slaves. Meaning that while the typical slaveholder owned only a handful of slaves, the typical slave lived on a plantation of some size. So loading and weighing cotton. So workers here bring their cotton to be weighed before dumping their load into the wagon. The field scale is a relatively crude device. The cotton is piled on a sheet or tarp, and then it is bundled together and placed on the scale. So each pile represents one person's production or pick. The white cotton fields in the background suggest that the scene depicted is early in the season. Usually a field of cotton would be picked 3 times, with the middle pick yielding the most cotton. Picking season started around late August and lasted sometimes until early December. But usually it was done by November. So as the institution of slavery grew and prospered in the new century, slaveholders in the new cotton producing states simply adopted the already existing laws for treating and handling slaves established prior to 1776. In the old tobacco regions, all of the slaveholding states adopted slave codes and laws that defined slaves as cattle property, human being with no human rights recognized in law. Birth certificate and social security card, driver's licenses and all that, registration. So numerous local ordinances at the county and town level created laws for disciplining slaves, for disciplining Negroes, Israelites. Everywhere in the South, slaveholders used the law to regulate and police slave trading, to regulate the activities of slaves off the plantation, and to define precisely what the enslaved were allowed to do and not to do, like today, the law of commerce, commercial law, commercial codes. So these laws govern practically all aspects of human life and activity for the enslaved. Although modeled after the Virginia slave codes, most of the newly settled southern states adopted slave codes more severe than those of the upper South. So Mississippi's slave codes of 1818 and 1848, for example, were the harshest and most specific codes of any southern state. See the slave laws map and state summaries in the geography section of this site. So one of the most curious facts of United States slavery is that slaves in the U.S. South reproduced themselves in numbers equal to the white birth rate. In almost all other nations in the Americas, slaves' mortality rates were so high that the slave population required massive importation of slaves in order for the institution to survive. In the American South, on the other hand, slaves tended to live in strong family environments, especially on the large plantations with extended kinship networks that enabled the slaves to reproduce themselves naturally. So planters well understood that a family environment helped control slaves in the sense that the threat of breaking up the slave family worked to undermine the slave rebellions and disobedience, because they did not want to be away from their family and their wife and their children. So the masters allowed them to get married and to have, and do their thing so they can be content with slavery, like today, like benefits, food stamps. So equally important, because of the ban on the importation of slaves into the United States after 1808, planters understood that good medical care and tolerable working conditions enabled their slaves to live longer lives. Medical benefits and stuff like that, benefits from work. And in jail they keep it nice and cold to keep you preserved. And you can't have anything long or any cords so you don't kill yourself. They need to preserve the product, the cattle. So this meant that slaves were considered not only a source of labor, but also a capital investment that might actually increase in value, like assets and liability books, especially in the case of enslaved women. So with no new slaves allowed to enter the nation legally after 1808, the enslaved African Americans on hand were bound to increase in value in proportion to the increase in demand for the cotton they produced. As the western states opened up to cotton production, a great new market for slaves increased the value of slaves even more in the upper south. So this caused inflation, as if we were dollars in currency. Like, hey, let's trade niggers instead of dollars and gold and silver. So just as slavery began in the Americas with the slave trade from Africa, it continued to grow and thrive in the United States because of the internal domestic slave trade, like the Internal Revenue System, which is the chiefs or the overhead or the supervisors of tribute, of wages, revenue, and all that stuff. Assets, expenses, and revenue, and liability, and all that. So by 1860, some 600,000 slaves had been transported from the upper south to the lower south, because then they have stricter rules down there. They can do what they want to do. Oh, we're going to teach you now, boy. Bend over. Hey, you, nigger, get over here. Whip him, or I'm going to whip you. And so it began. Rape her, or I'll rape you. And so it began. Black on black crime was taught to our people. Since the day Master said, hold this whip him. And we did it. Or watch brothers who didn't do it die one by one until someone did it. And then everyone else got the point. Like, okay, just do what Master say and we'll do good. Like, obey your authority clauses in the Bible, which is not Yah. Yah is our authority, not these white men. Don't turn any cheek. So many of these enslaved people were carried south as slaveholders purchased plantations and moved their families to the new cotton regions of the Mississippi Delta. So many more slaves were shipped south by slave traders who gathered surplus. They're dealing with us like accounting. Who gathered surplus slaves like refund in Virginia and Maryland to be walked overland in slave coffles or shipped coastwise in slave schooners and brigs. So Natchez Mississippi, for example, was the second largest slave market in the lower South after New Orleans. No wonder they hit that place up first. And that's the place of the Mardi Gras and all that. And there's a lot of violence there, like Compton. Boston, Dorchester, New York, West Palm Beach, Lake Worth, Flagler Drive, things like that. So in the Upper South, Alexandria and Richmond, Virginia, prospered as collection markets for slaves brought for sale from throughout the region. In the Upper South, Alexandria and Richmond, Virginia, prospered. So a slave coffle passing the United States Capitol. Another abolitionist image showing a manacled group of slaves being transported, probably either for sale or to the property of their buyer. Like China foreclosing on America right now, and they're liquidating on the treasury. So slaves were often transported for long distances over land in this fashion. The image shows the Capitol around 1815. Following the destruction of the partially built building by British troops in the War of 1812 and prior to the construction of the familiar done. So surviving slavery. So the most important thing to be said about slavery from the perspective of the enslaved is that millions of African Americans, Hebrew Israelites, endured slavery by making a world for themselves in the midst of their bondage. By 1776, a viable African American culture had emerged out of slavery, fashioned and shaped by the slaves themselves, partly out of the African past, but mainly in response to slavery as an institution, a product of slavery, a produce of harm. So so we've been harmed, we've been damaged, we're hurt right now, we're handicapped at the moment, because there's certain things we just do not know and will not know. 5 p.m. Halaluyahnu. Happy first day Eve, first day of the week Eve. So at the foundation of this enslaved culture stood the African American Hebrew Israelite family. Because of the nature of the work performed in slavery and the scarcity of labor, slaveholders usually allowed their human cattle to live in family cabins and to observe family connections. So slaveholders did this for simple economic reasons and to make it easier to control the slaves, like they did by emancipating you so you can go get a job and work for them, which made it easier to control you, the slaves. Whatever the reasons, slaves took advantage of the opportunity to use the family environment as a refuge and as a source of cultural endurance. And that's where some parts in scripture about family and stuff like that come in. So enslaved children learn family history from their parents by the stories told to them. That's why the information was preserved for quite a while, from word of mouth, while they worked alongside their mothers in the fields or at night in the slave cabins. Among the survival skills taught them were proper work habits, respect for elders, and reverence for a spiritual world, and how to deal with whites by putting on the massa. The massa. So, yes, master. Sorry, master. You know, they were teaching us that. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Please. May I please? Like they brought all that. That's begging. Like a dog. So that's not really being respectful. It's being a dog, a slave. Please, master? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So parents often demonstrated these lessons by acting ignorant and even silly around whites while mocking them when they were out of sight. So yes, master. When master leave, like, you damn cracker, and they'll giggle and laugh and like, what you say there, boy? Nothing, master. I'm sorry, master. I'll get to work right now. Like we had to play like people do in jail. So in this way, African American parents showed their children how to cope with slavery. Like today, my mom tried to do it with me, but it doesn't work all the time because I'm tired of being a slave. So by fooling the master without losing one's self-respect, so that's the moral of humility right there. That's the point. Just because they say we're something don't mean we're it. So and it ain't that easy. It takes a lot more than just that. Regardless of what they done, it would take much more than that too to wipe us out. Psalms 83. So in addition to relying on the strength of family networks, the enslaved turned to religion as a means of coping with slavery. That's when Christian, Catholic, and all that come in to play like a God, a savior, a cure during a time of misery and pain. That's when they introduce turn the other cheek principles to you and don't fight back or you're going to hell things. Lie. So during the colonial era, most enslaved Africans retained as best they could their indigenous African religions or Islam in the cases of those who had come from Muslim countries like the Moors. So it was not until the mid-18th century that large numbers of Africans began converting to Christianity. Mid-18th century. Africans began converting to Christianity during the religious revival movement that swept over the English colonies, the white people. So during this great awakening is called. English Methodists, and Baptists later preached on evangelical style of Christianity that appealed to the emotions and offered salvation to all who embrace Mashiach regardless of one's class or race. So, but the scripture wasn't built off that idea concept. So that's impersonating us in our identity and plagiarizing our script. So this new emotional religion, so it's an emotion based on a religion and imagination and versus facts. So blended nicely with African spiritual beliefs and religious practices. So its emphasis on singing, singing in church, emotional fervor, spiritual rebirth, and total body immersion in water until baptism was especially attractive to enslaved African Americans, Israelites, like they made us baptized with the Catholics. So those white slaveholders who embraced this evangelical Christianity allowed African Americans to attend white churches as long as the enslaved Christians sat apart from them and took communion at separate tables. So we're being converted through this thing. And it was making us easier to manage. Like they didn't even have to war with us no more. They can just hit you with Bible script over and over and over and over. Until you're like, all right, you're right. Makes sense. Maybe God does hate me, So although perhaps as many as 15% of all enslaved Africans were church members by 1780, usually attending the churches of their owners, their white slave owners, which were Christian. Many more practiced their own version of Christianity out of sight of whites. Gathering in brush arbors after dark, African American Christians sing, dance, shouted, and clapped to the preaching of African American ministers, usually illiterate holy men from the plantation or the neighborhood who conducted Christian marriages and burials. So we started to follow after the custom of the heathen round about us. So African American funerals reflected the African perspective on death as a moment of transcending life in which the dead returned to their homelands to be reunited with their ancestors. Zion, heaven, paradise. As a result, their funerals were joyous events with much dancing, music, drinking, laughter, and merriment, like Hebrew Israelites. Dance like David. So on the eve of the Civil War, most slaves practiced a form of evangelical Protestantism identified with Baptist and Methodist religions. The version of Christianity that they embrace emphasized the story of Moses and the delivery of Elohim's chosen people from bondage over those sermons that taught submissiveness to masters, turning the other cheek, and obedience to worldly authority. So they taught us sermons such as submit to masters, turn the other cheek, and obey authority. So it kept us enslaved even more through Christianity. In the introduction of Jesus to Epiphanes Antiochus. So with the abomination that caused desolation. So within the world of slavery, African Americans taught themselves a new language, practiced new art forms, and played a new kind of music that enabled them to endure the horrors of their bondage. So although most slaves had lost their African languages over the generations, some managed to hold on to parts of their old ways of speaking. In those areas where fresh infusions of African slaves arrived as late as 1808, like the coastal low country, sea islands of Georgia, and the low island marshes of Louisiana, African dialects hung on throughout the slave era. So Gula and Geechee's dialects. So Gula and Geechee's dialects, which are still spoken today, employ African words and grammatical elements within the basic English structure. So employ African words like Taino words and grammatical elements within the English-based structure. So more importantly, the loss of African language found African Americans fashioning a kind of Creole slave language. Boom, that's where Ahiti get Creole. That enabled them to communicate with one another. So it's like ghetto African mixed with French or some other stuff, English or Spanish, like patois. So most whites looked upon this new language as crude and ignorant, which they call slang, instead of seeing it for a new language rich in sense of place and meaning for the enslaved. So the Creole English or enslaved English or slang enabled African Americans to communicate with each other in ways not easily understood by their white overlords. So this was good for us, like code word slang. So the same point can be made about the music that came out of the slave experience. In attempting to keep enslaved Africans from communicating with each other, whites banned the use of drums. Wow. In their place, the enslaved perfected an African-based dance and music that reproduced the rhythms and cadences of African drumming. Although they weren't drumming, they were dancing as if they were drumming. Even in today's hip-hop and rap. And reggaeton and reggae. Music of the roots. The drum is the heart of each African, of the ancients. The drum. The beat of my heart. So they substituted hand clapping, body slapping, tapping the feet, or tap dancing, or patting juba, and rhyming shouts to accompany jigs, or rhymes and stuff, shuffles, stroots, and backstep dances. This created all that stuff, breakdancing and all, like, crumping, all types of dances in America. Like dances were created in Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Haiti from the mix. And this dancing and singing and shouting and glorifying helped free us, you see? They eventually called it voodoo. So they played gourd, fiddles, and banjo, bows, bells, and the bones. So they played the gourd, fiddles, and banjo, bows, bells, and the bones, all African American inventions or innovations, which we created a bunch of things and contributed to culture, language, arts, and science. So much of their musical expression occurred while worshiping at funerals and weddings, and while socializing in the evening after work. So the songs they sing while they work during the day help regulate the pace of their work, especially the call and response style of singing. And their spiritual songs, like sing-alongs and all that, came from us. Blended a style of sadness and jubilation that produced moving lyrics and uplifting messages of liberation and freedom, which they eventually called soul music. So as a result, or rhythm and blues, R&B, soul, stuff like that, hip hop, not rap, that's trash. So as a result, a valuable African American music emerged in antebellum America that soon became one of the world's most original art forms and the basis of modern day blues and jazz music and rock and rap and all that other stuff going on. So that came from us. So resisting slavery at its heart, American slavery was a brutal system based upon physical force, threats, torture, sexual exploitation, and intimidation. Police, sheriffs, judges, all that. Certain uniforms and colors and sounds. Woo, woo, woo. Messing with us. So any African American resisting overtly the orders of a slaveholder or almost any white in the community could expect immediate and often brutal retaliation. Oh, we're gonna show that nigger. So few laws prevented slaveholders from doing whatsoever they wanted with their human property. So accepted methods of punishment for slaves included verbal rebukes, a few cuts with a stick or riding whip, kicks to the body, boxing of ears, confinement in corn cribs or tool sheds, branding on the flesh of the hand or head with a hot iron applied for 20 seconds. Feel like the longest 20 seconds of your life. And mutilation of the body by clipping the ears, breaking legs, severing fingers, and slitting tongues. Whoa, these white people are wicked. So in some cases, slaves were forced to wear iron chains and shackles and handcuffs, and even iron masks, like a psychotic, on their heads for weeks and months at a time. For weeks and months. So, but the most common form of slave punishment was a severe whipping. That was very severe, like what occurred to Yahushua HaMashiach. So slave codes usually defined as a moderate whipping the laying on of 39 lashes on the bare back. 39 lashes on the bare back. So in some cases, the whippings could be quite severe in number, even over 39 whips, whoosh, 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 to their arm tire. Whoosh, whoosh. So, continuing on, thank you for your respect, my people. So for slaves who lived on large plantations, whippings and similar punishments were common. And a few slaves escaped at least one severe whipping in their life. Somehow, some way, by the grace and mercy and compassion of Yah. So here are 3 quotes from manuscript sources that suggest the extent to which floggerings were commonly applied. So on Sunday, last Adam was found to be drunk, upon which I ordered him to be confined to the Bastille. Also ordered him 500 lashes next day in order to draw a confession from him. Torture. How he came by the rum, which had the desired effect. So he acknowledged having secreted a key when he was cook, by which he got entrance to the store on the low land and stole rum. Ordered a large chain to be fixed to his leg. Wow. So ordered a large chain to be fixed to his leg. So which he had carried until today. Had it take off. his leg being swelled, as I intended carrying him up to Point Coupi, when I shall sell him if I find an opportunity. So, wow, that was William Dunbar, William in Dunbar, Mississippi planter, November 12, 1777. That's after their Independence Day. So the town guard took Nancy Lattimore and cut her all over her back, whipped her very much. She went through the market the next morning with her clothes hanging all off of each shoulder. Her back was very much whipped. It was thought Dr. Lattimore makes her walk in the street that way. William Johnson, a free person of Natchez, Mississippi, January 14, 1836. So several girls that was in a fight yesterday was whipped today. They got 15 lashes each. 3 of them, the Gibson girl and Betty Dumont, and a girl of the Miss Lacrosse. William Johnson, a free person of Natchez, Mississippi, February 23rd, 1847. So these are the things that we were going through. Let me see where we're at on time. So we might have to take a pause real quick if there's too much left. So let's see. Okay, so we're gonna have a little bit more left. If there's one more, I'm gonna pause. Alright. Okay, so we'll come back to that in our next part. But I do thank y'all for being here with me all the way up to this point. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. When we come back, we're going to be continuing on from where we left off. It seems like there are going to be a couple more videos before we complete. So please be patient with me until then. And I truly, truly hope you guys have a wonderful day. Alright, so when we come back, we'll start off from here. Shalom, y'all. Hallelujah.